The Hellraiser from Helsinki.
The look and the presence he had was world class. He was big, he was tall, he was muscular, he was a real life badass. But the reason why we're doing this television program now is not because he was a great wrestler that was a standout for years, but because he was in wrestling and then did some other batshit stuff.
Wrestler Tony Halme, aka Ludwig Borga, the Hellraiser from Helsinki, lived a life of controversy.
He made people around him uncomfortable, but not in a good way.
And crime.
You don't know that story? He got deported from this country for weapons.
Toni Halmeen epäillään syyllistyneen ammuskeluun varhain tänä aamuna.
Driven by a desire for fame, Tony took his strongman persona to the extreme.
Mitä paremmin vedät roolissa, sen enemmän tulee rahaa.
He wanted to be the person that people were like, could you believe he said that? Could you believe he did that?
And into the corridors of political power.
That guy's gonna be an elected official?
He wanted to be famous, so that's how he was gonna do that in Finland.
Vähän rasistiset puheet tai siihen suuntaan ja...
Until his relentless pursuit of the spotlight led to infamy and ended in tragedy.
Uppers to wake up, downers to go to sleep, and now you gotta have something to make you feel alive during the day.
Plus ja tällainen julkisuus, niin toisille se on kaiken vaarallisinta huumetta.
What more did he have to live for? The dream was over.
The image he had created for himself became impossible to maintain.
He looked like a villain, he sounded like a villain, but unfortunately in real life, he was a villain.
In the summer of 1993, wrestling fans witnessed the debut of Ludwig Borga, an arrogant new villain from Finland.
Missing in the roundhouse. Whoa, man! This guy's a tough dude!
The foreign heel in professional wrestling has been a standby since the turn of the 20th century. They were exotic, they were mysterious, they were not like us. You ain't from around here, are you, boy? I'm Jim Cornette, and I was working for the WWF when Tony Halm, aka Ludwig Borga, made his brief but spectacular run. The fans could take their animosity out by booing the anti-American.
Maybe you sang that Russian national anthem just one time too many.
Vince McMahon loved the foreign heel concept so much that if we didn't have a problem with a country, he would figure one out.
From Helsinki, Ludwig Borga.
So suddenly, you get this guy named Ludwig Borga from Finland, and because he had an accent, that was close enough for Vince McMahon. I can do something with this guy.
USA stand for in my continent. You stink a lot.
He was going to get a great push because it was easy to position him as a villain. I'm Jim Ross, and I was an on-air talent in 1993 for the WWE. One way you get a villain noticed is you have him break a streak, and Tatanka had a winning streak.
Tatanka wins the 40.
Being the Native American, representing America, the fans just connected right to me. I'm Tatanka, an official legend of WWE. I was running on an undefeated streak for 2 years. When the office came to me, they said, we're really looking to do something big with Ludwig Borga.
Locking up now, Ludwig Borga.
In our business, it's called rubbing. You get out there and you rub shoulders with Hulk Hogan, that stardom rubs off on you.
Reaching over the top rope to the outside, I can't believe that.
Ludwig had a tremendous opportunity. The best thing for you to do is sell it, and he wanted me to sell it. So Ludwig threw me in the ring and then pinned me with one finger.
Look at this! His finger on Tatanka's chest! I can't believe it! One away for a win streak to come in with one finger!
By beating me, it instantly puts Ludwig right at the top of the ladder.
Now, in hindsight, knowing what we know now, do you still think that he was the right guy to end your
Now looking at it, no. The power of that WWF TV is tremendous. Having a fan base that buys your action figures and sells them out. But remember, we're on the road 300 days a year. So you're in the locker room a lot. You know, they want guys who are going to be in there friendly with everybody because now you can do business together. But Ludwig was never that guy. Not that the guys had anything against him. He just never allowed the guys to get close to him. Let's put it that way.
Borga had a great look, but he was a miserable human being. People didn't want to work with him. He made people around him uncomfortable. And then when we finally realized he had the SS tattoo on his calf, things started going downhill from there.
For the kids out there who weren't around, the SS was Hitler's private army that committed many of the atrocities at Hitler's behest in Nazi Germany. You can't show something like that on television in 1990-something in America, so they said cover that shit up.
One of the boys, if they would have seen that, I guarantee you someone would have said something. So obviously it was kept undercover.
We made a mistake in hiring him. He slipped by us.
Tremendous strength and agility. Yeah!
It wasn't done on purpose.
Scripts. Ludwig Borga in complete control of.
We just didn't do a good job of vetting him. You can imagine how some of the Jewish talents in the locker room reacted to him. It's not right to impose upon them such negativity. We need to get rid of him.
The fact that he had it to begin with indicated that probably something was going on up there that maybe we didn't want to delve into much deeper.
Drop him! Come on, Ralph!
Tony Halme's childhood was defined by bitterness, brawls, and resentment.
One thing to know about Tony is that he came from a broken home. His parents divorced when Tony was just 2 years old. His father had a problem with alcohol, and it seems like his mother did too. I'm Mikko Marttinen, a journalist and the writer of Tony Halme's biography. The other important thing to know about Tony is that he kind of struggled between two language communities. His mother was originally a Swedish speaker and decided to put the boys into a Swedish-speaking school. This made Tony feel like an outsider from very early on in his life.
Olimme suomenruotsalaisia, niin heillä oli omat alueet yleensä lähiöissä. Ihmiset karsasti. Just kun suomenruotsalainen oli vähän niin kuin, mitä se sieltä ei ole tietysti, ettei ollut inttareita. Olin Krister Markusas Toni Halmeen lapsuuden ystävä.
13-14, niin sitten äitini valitsi mieluummin pullon kuin tai alkoholistimiehen kuin me. Sitten mä lähdin 14-15 kotoa pois, että...
Toni muutti silloin meille, kato, mun vapaaseen huoneen. Enemmän alettiin nyrkkeille ja hän alkoi nostaa puntteja ja halusi massaa.
He yearned for respect. He felt that he was looked down upon because of his poverty.
Years before he ever stepped into a wrestling ring, Tony constructed a new ultra-masculine persona for himself, which he referred to as the Viking.
As soon as Tony stepped out to the street, he became the Viking. He had the word Viking with a helmet tattooed on his arm. He started to talk tough, rob people, and getting into street fights. In the newspaper archives, I found a very old item. It says that two karate guys were just beating up everybody in a bar. Turns out those karate guys were Tony and his best friend Krister. Tony was fascinated with movies. The one movie that really made an influence on him was Taxi Driver. Maybe Tony saw him as same kind of outsider as Robert De Niro. And when he saw that movie, he decided that he will move to the United States someday.
In 1986, Tony heads to Los Angeles searching for fame, fortune, and a new direction.
He wanted people to like him. People like you because you're famous. And I think that was a shield for a lot of insecurities that he had. My name is Dee Dee, and I was once married to Tony Holomé. Size-wise and personality-wise, Tony was larger than life. Fell in love with him pretty quickly. When we got married, he wanted the music to be God Bless America. He wanted to be famous in America. He wanted to be a movie star in America. And he heard about Gold's Gym in Venice Beach. He attempted to be a bodybuilder, but he just didn't have the shape of a bodybuilder. He had a big belly. He was a big guy everywhere.
It became almost like an obsession for him to be as big as possible, and steroids helped.
He had a shoebox, and it had steroids from Russia. It was clearly nefarious. I'll never forget, one of the packages was for horses. His ambitions were to be a star, whatever way that came to him.
He got some small roles for Little Caesars.
Tip.
He was in a national ad, in some beer commercials.
Get back to work!
And eventually some small roles on TV as well.
No one argues with curling.
Hanging in the Gold's Gym, a lot of people told him that you should go into wrestling. You could really earn some money with this, and they got Tony interested. He did some wrestling shows with Herb Abrams, UWF.
He had a costume made, and it was Tony as the Viking.
I told you I'm gonna hurt every pencil neck, every pipsqueak who steps in my way. And there's only one way they're gonna leave the ring, is on the stretcher. Hurt. I think UWF should start to sell life insurance too.
It was silly. It was very silly. Japan was probably his first big wrestling shows that he did.
Tony told everybody that he was a successful boxer in Finland. None of this was true. He had never had a boxing fight in Finland. But New Japan made his gimmick about that.
Tony Holm had become a star in wrestling in Japan, where they liked big guys, giant monsters battling it out, King Kong and Godzilla.
The Japanese wrestling circuit is really tough. It was very punishing for the wrestler's body, and Tony was very candid about starting to use strong painkillers during his time in Japan. It really became a habit for him. Somewhere along the lines, Tony's opportunities in Japan started to dwindle a little bit. His attitude was not great.
When I met Tony, the way that he spoke to you made you understand that he really held himself to be somebody. But you have to know who else is in the room. My name is Michael Maggiolotti, alias the Rebel Starbuck. I'm the pioneer of Finnish professional wrestling. Tony would wrestle tags alongside guys like Scott Norton against the Japanese contingents. From what I've heard, Tony Holomé rubbed some people the wrong way, ethnically. He had sympathies towards the white brotherhood. He had a lot of friends who were skinheads and whatever else. And the wrong thing came out of his mouth, and a fight broke out between Scott Norton and Tony Holomé at the bar. I think that enough was enough, and now it was Judgment Day.
Tony had a very famous incident with Scott Norton, an American wrestler. Some people say that Tony kind of sucker punched Scott Norton.
Then again, Scott Norton says that he cleaned Tony Holomé's clock.
This was a problem for New Japan. Two of their foreign stars were not getting along.
Kaikki halusi olla tietysti siinä valokiilassa ja ne ei oikein musta tykännyt, koska mä olin taas suomalainen ulkomaalainen ja mä tulin suoraan siihen main eventtiin, eli päämatsiin.
And that was the end of Tony in Japan.
With Tony back in California, his wife rethinks their 3-year marriage.
There were a lot of things going on at the time that I overlooked. But it wasn't until he cheated on me that I knew what kind of person I was married to. As much as I didn't want to be with him anymore, I still loved him. And at the point that I decided I needed to divorce him, he got very emotional and, oh my God, I'm so sorry I did this to you. And I'm going to take my truck and drive off the pier. And I just said, I can't do this anymore. I woke up to a lot of things that he lied about, but I never imagined that he would turn into the person he turned into. As soon as we split up, that's when he became Ludwig Borga.
We're back, ladies and gentlemen.
In 1993, Tony joins the World Wrestling Federation as a main event villain, but his run with the company lasts less than a year.
After they gave him that push of defeating me, they were building him up for Lex Luger. But the fans never got behind it. They were giving him all the vignettes and all those interviews and bringing him into TV, but his interviews were just like, blah.
This time it's gonna be hard and tough, and I'm gonna finish this American so-called hero once and for all.
Sometimes he's speaking Finnish to the cameras. He says things like, which is Finnish for like, I'll rip your ass off or something like that.
You heard that, didn't you? Whatever you say.
Most people in the U.S. don't even know where Finland resides on the world map. So why should anybody feel threatened by who you are?
American stinks. Lex Luger stinks. So Americans choke on this.
He lacked the ability to connect with the audience. The nuances of being a pro wrestler he did not possess. And then we saw the SS tattoos on his calf and understood his philosophies that were not very healthy. How do you justify it? How do you justify an SS tattoo based on what that stood for, and still to this day?
I think the reason he got the tattoo on his leg was because he got attention for being fascinated by the Nazi thing. I remember he spent some time in Russia, and he came back with all kinds of military memorabilia that was used by, I guess, Nazis, or I don't know. But one of the things was this creamer pitcher, and on the bottom it had a swastika on it. And it was dated like 1941. And I had used it as a flower pot in our house. I didn't know that they were Nazi material. I was just a young, naive person. I didn't know shit from Shinola at that age. But why would somebody get an exit-only tattoo on their rear end? Why?
What the would propel a man to tattoo exit only above his asshole, especially when you're the size he is and look like that? Do you really need to have written instructions for people not to you in the ass? Does there have to be a written warning? What the is going on with that? And who are you making that statement to when you're walking down the street? You're so anti-homosexual that you have exit only tattooed above your asshole. Who's gonna know? Don't him in the ass.
While wrestling at Madison Square Garden, Tony injures his ankle in a match.
With Tony being injured, he was unceremoniously dropped, and I don't know if any of the audience really missed him either.
Whatever the reason became was good to get rid of him. I'm glad he did get hired on my watch. And he pretty much self-destructed once he left WWE.
So if WWE is no longer an option, where do you go from here?
So Tony is looking for work, and he gets signed to fight in UFC.
And now he tries to make the transition to the UFC.
And Tony doesn't take the training very seriously.
First I try to hit him as hard as I can. If I miss that one, I rip his arms off the socket or his legs off the socket. So
His opponent ends up being Randy Couture, who will become a legend of the sport.
2 first-timers to the UFC. Let's get it on! And we're looking at a big size difference here. Oh.
Prior to the fight, he had said, I will never tap out. I will rather get out of there dead. But, you know, as soon as the choke is on, he ends up losing in 1 minute. That's the end of his MMA career. Tony went back to LA. He was getting married again, this time with a Finnish woman.
The police came and raided their house. The SWAT team and guns and bulletproof vests and shields.
Tony was charged with trafficking controlled substances, which were steroids, and possession of a legal firearm, an Uzi.
When we were together, Tony liked to shoot guns because they gave him power. I never imagined that he would become a guy that got in trouble with guns.
Kertoi mulle, kun se joutui tuohon Shark Tankiin, LA County Jailiin. Ja kyllä tuli kylmä hiki, kun se... Ja siellä oli Adrian Brothers yksi kaveri, niin se huusi, kato, Ludwig Borga. Ne otti sen sinne sitten.
The laws were very clear. If you had been convicted of a firearm felony in the United States, you should be deported. And that's what they did. And he could never go back to the United States again.
He went back to Finland to chase the big and famous dream.
Tony's quest for fame in America is cut short, forcing him back to Finland to pursue his dream once more.
I think it was a really hard blow for Tony to be forced to leave the United States. He wants to be famous, he's a showman, so he's ready to try everything. He was the Finnish heavyweight professional boxing champion, and all of us kids loved his character. In the Finnish version of the TV show Gladiators,
kaikki tietää maailmassa gladiaattorit. Hänen rooli oli pelottava viikinki. Moikka, mä oon Marianne. Eka kertaa näin Tonin ja käteltiin gladiaattorikuvauksissa Helsingissä. Ja me oltiin treenikavereita. Hän oli elementissään. Tonin tässä viikinkimyytissä oli täysin 100% se Toni, mikä hän halusi olla.
And then Tony gets his segment in a Finnish talk show where he records a single where he, in a very comical way, brags about how manly he is.
Polttoaineena on raaka testosteroni.
It sells very well, and he will record a whole record. At this point, Tony Halme is one of the most famous people in Finland, in fact. Everything Tony touches is gold.
To the Finnish people, he really was superhuman. He achieved something. He was in Hollywood. He went to do Die Hard 3.
Wait, Jesus, don't open it, it's a bomb.
Even though it was a side role, he was a goon. That broke the news barrier as far as making Tony Halme a household name.
He had learned in wrestling how to sell his character, and he decides to write an autobiographical book. Almost like a political manifest. It's Tony's life story with a lot of violence, a lot of sex, but a lot of it is made up and embellished. A lot of those stories are offensive to many people. He uses the N-word a lot. He's very traditional when it comes to the roles of men and women. There's a lot of people who hate him, but there's certainly a big segment of Finnish population that really looks up to him.
Tony's polarizing infamy attracts Finnish power brokers eager to cash in on his natural charisma and headline-grabbing antics.
Jotkut rakastivat ja jotkut vihasivat ja sellainen tietenkin myy hyvin. Nimeni on Veikko Vallin ja tutustuin Toniin 2000-luvun alussa. Ensimmäisen kerran tapasin Tonin henkilökohtaisesti, kun minun yritys aloitti proteiinijuoman kehittämisen niin kuin isoille miehille tarkoitetun. Meidän piti löytää siihen sitten sopiva henkilö promoamaan sitä. No, ajatus siitä, että Toni lähtee politiikkaan, se oli aluksi niin kuin vitsi. Sitten kun pohdimme sitä, että mikä puolue olisi hyvä, Toni sitten ehdotti jotain tällaista natsipuoluetta, ettei Suomessa ole sellaiselle aatteelle mitään kannatusta.
They contact Timo Soini, who is the leader of the very small True Finns party, which is really struggling at that time.
He joined the political party in Finland that were the troublemakers. And he was a troublemaker.
No joo, me tehtiin Tonille sitten oma verkkosivu, siis kun sä tulit sille sivulle, niin siinä tuli nyrkki ensin ja se kuvaruutu heilahti.
But let's say the SS tattoo. How it didn't play into his political career is, I think it's a question of timing.
During that time, Finland changed in a number of ways. The Cold War ended, we joined the European Union, the immigration began rising. And this coincided with an economic recession. As you can guess, a lot of these immigrants became scapegoats for the troubles that people had.
I think that a lot of Finns were very proud of being Finnish. So when you do away with national identity, a lot of people saw it as a threat. So that's why I believe that he was forgiven. Let's take care of our own before we take care of anybody else. We weren't as liberal then as a nation as we are now. And he had charisma, especially for the Finnish people, for the Finnish audience. They understood him.
The closest equivalent to Tony Halme as a politician is Donald Trump. The feelings they evoke in their audience are much more important than facts.
And if you look at it, so many parallels in pro wrestling and politics. It's all about how to manipulate people's emotions.
Tony said what he thought, and he didn't have any regard for political correctness.
Niin kuin monsa, että mulla on homofobia. Eihän mä niitä pelkää, ne pelkää mua.
He also didn't care if the things that he said were true or not.
Didn't he say that Tarja Halonen, our president at the time, didn't he say that she was a lesbian?
Toni antoi sen haastattelun ja sitten mä kysyin häneltä, että mihin sä annoit tuon haastattelun. Toni sanoi, että no se oli joku radiokanava, mutta kai ne sen leikkaa pois. Että no se oli suora lähetys.
Kaduttaako sinua? En edelleenkään. Mä sanoinkin, että mua kaduttaa se, että enintään se, että monet Suomen naiset niin kuin siitä otti itteensä. Mä en halunnut mitään.
He talks about immigration in a way that is actually extremely offensive and racist.
Rikostilastot rumenevat samaa tahtia, kun ulkomaalaisten määrä maassamme kasvaa.
Eli että kun hän huomasi, että ne vähän rasistiset vitsit uppoavat siihen hänen yleisönsä, niin hän ajatteli, että no vedetään. Mutta hänellä taas oli bingo-pango ja apu-babu, jotain tällaisia.
Mikä on halventava? Silloin mä voin ehkä joskus kännissä, että mä en muista mikä sen Pavienin nimi oli, joka haastatteli mut. Se on mun tapa, mutta edelleenkin mä uskon tähän demokratiaan ja en mä suutani siivo, koska ihmiset äänesti Toni Viikinkin Halmea.
Toimittajat keskusteli, että pitäisikö Tonista kirjoittaa ollenkaan mitään, pitäisikö se vaieta kokonaan, että onko se niin kuin vaarallinen henkilö suomalaiselle yhteiskunnalle, voiko häntä päästää televisioon niin kuin ollenkaan. Että onko nämä liian radikaaleja nämä mielipiteet. Sitten se vaalipäivänä näkyy, että kehen ihmiset luottaa.
Ehkä yksi vielä suurempi ääniharava yllätys oli Toni Halme, joka Helsingissä valittiin perussuomalaisten listoilta eduskuntaan.
Kaikki meni hyvin, kunnes sitten Toni valittiin eduskuntaan. Siitä alkoi alamäki.
Following a campaign fueled by nationalist pride, Toni Halme stuns Finland's political establishment with a landslide victory.
Incredibly good numbers. It was gangbusters. People just voted for this guy en masse.
Eli Toni sai 5. eniten ääniä koko Suomessa.
Ollut ehkä mulle suurempi yllätys kuin niille lopulle suomalaisille, jotka ei mua äänestänyt.
If you had said in the locker room at the time, see that guy over there, he's going to be elected to political office. You would say, somebody needs to treat this guy. If you'd have said he's going to be a nationalist right-wing lunatic, I'd have said, okay, I'll buy that. But politician, I wouldn't have got that far.
Now in office, Tony escalates his divisive rhetoric.
Sinä olet itse sillä kannalla, että tuomioita pitäisi koventaa kädet. Miksi?
Koska näin on mies, joka kädettömänä raiskaa naisen.
Ja me tietenkin ympärillä, jotka oltiin, niin oltiin sillä, että Toni, että voitko vähän rauhoittua, että tämä on vähän niin kuin noloa. Mutta ei mitään, Toni on. Ei häntä pystynyt pidättelemään. Että.
Toni oli sellainen mies, joka sanoi ne asiat, mitä monet miettii.
Mä voin kertoa, että ne ihmiset, jotka asuvat ulkomaalaisten naapurissa, nukkuvat erittäin huonosti, jos ollenkaan.
A lot of people hold Tony Halme to be I guess a white supremacist would be the correct term.
Kutsua esimerkiksi mua natsiksi tai jotain muuta, niin se on pikkasen eri kuin sanoa jotain, että
Sano, että tärkeintä on pysyä vaan koko ajan otsikoissa, että silloin jengi puhuu, niin se osasi sen kyllä.
Natsi, se on pikkasen eri, kun mä haukun jotain homoksi. Mä oon niin aivan varma, että joka ikinen niistä 90 juutalaista olisi mieluummin nuolu jonkun perseen kunnollisesti kaustettu. Kysy selluiksi.
Näin varmasti on.
Itse huomasin, kun olin siellä sitten eduskunnassa hänen kanssa samassa huoneessa, niin ne tarinat vaihtuivat viikoittain. Sanoit, no joo, ei sitä aina muista, mitä sitä on tullut sanottua. Että se oli koko ajan se fakta ja fiktio meni hänellä.
Että hänellä oli kuitenkin siinä aviovaimo ja asiat sillä tavalla taloudellisesti niin kuin hyvin ja niin kuin ulkopuolisen silmin ei pitäisi olla mitään sellaista, mikä olisi hänet vienyt niin kuin siihen tuhoon. Että kyllä mä näen, että suurin syy on se trauma, mikä hänessä oli. Niin silloin se tuhon kierre on todella voimakas.
At this point, he had already developed a serious alcoholism problem on top of his drug addiction.
Kyllä sen ymmärtää, katsoo sen lääkeaineiden ja hormonien ja huumeiden ja alkoholisen sekoituksen, kun se koktaili oli koko ajan päällä, hedelmäkulho täynnä niitä ja kello tarkkuudella otetaan milloin mitäkin. Ja Tonihan käytti sanontaa, että Veikko, elämä on kemiaa.
By 2003, Tony's increasing substance abuse becomes impossible to ignore.
Sitten huomaa sen, että tämä liukuu väärään suuntaan. Sä yrität jarruttaa tilannetta. Kaiken oot tehnyt. Ja sehän on pakko päästää irti siinä kohtaa, kun olin kesäkuun alussa irtisanouduin ja lähdin sitten. Ja sitten tapahtui nämä kaikki ikävät käänteet.
Tony had promised to have an exhibition match against his old friend and sparring partner. The fight became quite brutal, especially for Tony, who really got a beating in that fight. After the fight, Tony starts to drink. He goes to Tampere where he has some friends, keeps on drinking. After about 2 weeks of this binge, he finally returns home to his wife. They develop an argument. The wife says, "We're through, I've had enough of your drinking." Tony grabs a handful of medicine, swallows them. The wife, of course, wants to call the 911. At some point, Tony gets hold of a gun. The wife tries to grab the gun away from Tony, and during the struggle, the gun goes off. To this day, we're not sure whose finger was on the trigger, but the wife flees the apartment, calls 911. She goes back inside the apartment and she finds that Tony is unconscious. He has swallowed some of his own puke and doesn't really show any signs of life, really.
Kansanedustaja Toni Halmeen epäillään syyllistyneen ammuskeluun varhain tänä aamuna.
Poliisin mukaan kukaan ei loukkaantunut välikohtauksessa. Silminnäkijät kuitenkin kertovat, että Halme vietiin tapahtuman jälkeen pois paikalta ambulanssilla.
At this point, Tony is in a coma. There are all kinds of infections and he has suffered from lack of oxygen, and so he's in a pretty critical condition.
Poliisi on ollut tänään yhteydessä Halmetta hoitaviin lääkäreihin, joiden mukaan Halme on yhä heikossa kunnossa.
He really struggled for his life for the first couple of weeks. Eventually, they managed to revive him. But by this point, it's clear that he has suffered some serious brain damage. He can only talk like one word at a time, and he starts the slow process of recuperating.
Kyllä niin kuin pimennossa on paljon asioita, että en muista sen päivän tapahtumia tai edellisen päivän tai edellisen monta edellisen viikonkaan tapahtumia, että on niin kuin pyyhkiytynyt pois.
But he's never back to his old, colorful, quick-thinking self. People could see that he was not the old Tony at all. His marriage ended, that made things only worse. He was depressed.
Kansanedustaja Toni Halme saa syytteen useista eri rikoksista, jotka liittyvät kesäiseen ampumaan.
Eli onko aivan sama mikä tuomio tulee, jos oikeus sinut tuomitsee, niin aiot erota?
Kyllä.
Sitten se alkoi tekemään vastaväitettä tuolle tuomarille, että hän harjoitteli roolia. Hän on vanginvartija SS-leirillä Porvoossa, että hänellä piti olla se luugeri ja... Kyllä, totta.
Tony resigns from Parliament and receives a 4-month suspended sentence. Now on disability, his health struggles push him deeper into isolation.
Varmaan häpesi sitä, että miten asiat menivät sitten. Se viikinki-imago alkoi murentua.
Things were getting bleaker all the time. He was seriously addicted to painkillers, used a lot of alcohol. He continued to do steroids as well, but obviously they don't help you if you cannot do the training.
Vieläkö iso rauta tottelee miestä?
Kyllä tottelee.
Penkiltä lähtee paljon.
No 150 ehkä.
Niin Toni sanoi vaan, että näissä lihaksissa on viikinki, ja jos lihakset lähtee, niin hänen psyyke ei kestä sitä.
Nyrkkeilyura oli jäänyt unohduksi, painista se muisti vähän, pätkittäin.
He kept doing these appearances in little bars around Finland, and that was the only really thing that got him out of the house at that point.
Hän ei ollut enää, sai istua yksin baarin nurkassa. Kukaan ei enää mennyt juttelemaan.
Muut naureskeli siellä pöydässä, kun mä kävin hakemaan sen. Se istui yksin siellä kuset housussa nurkassa.
It appears that he got in debt also because of the drugs that he had to buy from the black market.
Oksikontteja. Ne maksoi 50 € kappale tabletti. Niistä tulee niitä hallusinaatioita ja tällaista. Voi yhtäkkiä alkaa ottaa ilmasta, tiedätkö?
You've been to the mountaintop and you have to come down because there's nowhere else to go. For a lot of people, I think it's too much. You'd rather end it than become nobody again.
Mä olin sitten, hänen syntymäpäivää piti viettää. Mä käyn oven takana, kun mulla oli avain sinne asuntoon. Soitan, niin puhelin kuuluu sisällä. Soitin sit poliisit. Se oli pimeä se koko osio siellä. Mä luulin, että Toni nukkuu, siis oli niin kuin näin siinä. Ampunut itseänsä.
Entinen kansanedustaja ja nyrkkeilijä Toni Halme on kuollut.
On January 10th, 2010, Tony Halme is found dead by suicide, bringing a sudden end to his turbulent life.
Halme oli 47-vuotias.
Why did he arrive to that decision? Obviously, we can only speculate. But it must have been very hard for him to see himself in the condition that he was, which was so far removed from the ideal that he always held of a big, strong man.
Toni joskus sanoi, että hän on mieluummin niin kuin vuoden leijonana kuin 40 vuotta hiirenä. Kun se viikinki oli poissa, niin ei ollut syytä elää enää.
Not surprised. Didn't shed a tear. What does a person do to another person where you don't even get emotional about that? Because he was a piece of shit and he burned the bridges. You know, he treated people horribly.
Mä uskon, että Tonin motivaatio treenata salilla, tulla vahvaksi oli ihan sama kuin minulla. Tulla vahvaksi, ettei kukaan voi vahingoittaa. Ja sitten kun lähdetään menemään sinne juurisyyhyn, mitä Toni itse sanoi, että hän on niin kuin ollut katkera elämälle, mitä hänelle on niin kuin tapahtunut, että äiti ei välittänyt. Siinä isossa äijässäni mä näin sen pikkupojan, joka kaipasi sitä huomiota ja rakkautta. Ehkä vähän sitä halveksuntaa ja sitten sitä vihaa. Että on ihan varma, että lapsuuden traumat on tehnyt hänestä sellaisen kuin hän on. Mutta jos sitä ei käsittele, niin se viha vaan kulkee koko aika matkassa mukana, että ihminen tuhoo lopulta itsensä.
So, what is his legacy? He was best known as Ludwig Borga, a nondescript heel from Finland who never really connected with the audience.
I was ringside. Can't remember a Ludwig Borga match because he just didn't stand out in that environment.
He was an asshole. And that's where I'll leave it.
Tony brought everything that he had learned in the American show business and in wrestling to Finland at the right time, and really revolutionized Finnish politics in a lot of the same ways that Donald Trump changed politics in the United States. And this really paved the way for a lot of politicians that ran on anti-immigration themes everywhere in Europe during the next couple of decades.
Tähän oli juuri tulossa. Tässä kirjasi lopussa sanot näin, että menestyminen on paras kosto.
Niille, jotka mä elämäni varrella jouduin kestämään ja sitä se on mulle ehkä läksynä muillekin, että katkeruus ehkä on hyvä.
I want people to know that there was a good side to this person, you know, and I wouldn't have fallen in love with somebody that was a complete monster the way that we know of him now.
Sitten enkä pyydä keneltäkään anteeksi, koska mä en ole kenekään sitä myöskään velkaa.
But I think he destroyed himself in every way that a person could do that.
Welcome to this special presentation. I am your host, and today we peel back the curtain on one of the most harrowing, transcendent, and debated chapters in the history of professional wrestling. We're talking about the night that fundamentally changed the trajectory of the industry, a night where the line between scripted entertainment and life-altering reality was not just blurred, but completely shattered. On the 28th of June, 1998, at the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, the world witnessed The Undertaker versus Mankind inside the demonic structure known as Hell in a Cell. To those who watched it, it was a moment that hit the consciousness like a mallet. It was a masterpiece, yes, but a dangerously, hauntingly crazy one. As we analyze the legacy of that evening, we must confront the uncomfortable, echoing question: was it worth it? According to the accounts of those who were there, including the hardcore legend himself, Mick Foley, this match was the culmination of a desperate need to be relevant. In the world of professional wrestling, Mick Foley was a man who felt an overwhelming need to be liked, a desire born from his own vulnerabilities. He discovered early on that if he could not make people love him, he could certainly make them react to him. Whether it was leaping off furniture with fake blood or enduring the brutal death matches of Japan, Foley was constantly chasing a reaction. By the time he arrived in the World Wrestling Federation, he was a man driven by the need to prove that his unique, visceral style had a place at the top of the card. Vince McMahon, as noted by industry insiders like Jim Ross and Gerald Briscoe, was initially skeptical. He did not see the marketable potential in a man like Mick Foley. Yet, it was the pairing with The Undertaker, a titan of the industry, that forced the creative direction toward something truly revolutionary. The concept of Hell in a Cell was designed to be the ultimate stage. But as Terry Funk, a mentor to Foley, recalled, the decision to begin the match on top of the cage was born from a conversation that started as a joke and ended in a grim reality. When the bell rang, the audience was stunned. No one expected them to start on the roof of the cage. As the structure groaned under the weight of two men, the reality of the danger became apparent. The zip ties holding the structure together began to give way, a terrifying prelude to what would follow. Then it happened. The image of a 300-pound human being plummeting 20 feet through an announcer's table remains etched in the minds of everyone who saw it. It looked like a car crash. It looked in that terrifying moment like the end of a life. Yet, in a display of what can only be described as superhuman willpower, Foley returned. The backstage reaction was one of pure, unadulterated panic. Dr. Francois Petit, who worked as the ringside physician, described the scene as chaotic. The match was a living, breathing creature. It was not supposed to continue, yet it did. The second act, the choke slam through the top of the cell onto the canvas, was, according to those involved, a moment where the structural integrity of the human body was tested to its breaking point. Foley was knocked unconscious for 42 seconds. When he came to, he found himself amidst thumbtacks and broken teeth, driven by an almost pathological commitment to the spectacle. This was not just a match. It was a testament to the cost of fame. The collateral damage was severe. Foley suffered a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a bruised kidney, and countless stitches. But as the participants and their families, including his wife Colette and daughter Noelle, would later reflect, the price was far higher than physical scars. It was the beginning of a cycle of concussions and trauma that would define the rest of his life. According to his own testimony and the concerns of those close to him, Foley felt he had to live up to the moniker of the hardcore legend. This led to further brutal encounters, most notably the infamous I Quit match against The Rock, where he endured 11 unprotected chair shots to the head. It is a sobering reflection on the lack of knowledge regarding long-term brain injuries in that era. Today, we understand the specter of chronic traumatic encephalopathy and the devastating impact of repetitive head trauma. The question remains, how do we reconcile the genius of the performance with the long-term suffering of the performer? Mick Foley has spent years processing the weight of that night in Pittsburgh. He has shifted from resentment, feeling that his entire career was overshadowed by one fall, to a place of acceptance. He and The Undertaker, the two men who stood in that cage, eventually came to understand that what they built that night would outlive them both. In the end, we are left with a story of a man who gave his heart and soul to a business that often demanded everything in return. It is a cautionary tale of ambition, the pursuit of validation, and the limits of human endurance. As we look back at the footage, we are forced to wonder in the pursuit of the roar of the crowd. At what point does the cost become too high? Was it a masterpiece, or was it a tragedy in the making? Perhaps it was and remains both. Welcome to the Squared Circle, folks. I am your host, and today, we are pulling back the curtain on one of the most harrowing chapters in the history of professional wrestling. You know the name, you know the legend, and if you were watching on June 28th, 1998, you know exactly where you were when the world stopped turning. We are diving deep into the Hell in a Cell match between The Undertaker and Mankind. This is not just a match, it is a defining moment, a masterpiece of chaos, and a cautionary tale that echoes through the annals of the business. The architect of pain. To understand the madness at the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, we have to understand the man behind the mask, Mick Foley. In an industry built on larger-than-life personas, Foley was an outlier. He was a man who, by his own admission, felt a desperate, gnawing need to be liked. As he grew up, he discovered a dark truth. If he could not make the world love him, he would make them watch him in a state of absolute, visceral disgust. According to those who knew him, including his wife, Colette, beneath the hardcore exterior was a man of gentle humor, but inside the ring, he transformed into a vessel for absolute endurance. He carved his path through the brutal, violent death matches of Japan, where he learned that to stand out, he had to be willing to go where no one else dared. When he arrived in the World Wrestling Federation, the brass, specifically Vince McMahon, was, to put it mildly, skeptical. They saw a man who did not fit the traditional mold of a star. But as Jim Ross, then the vice president of talent relations, noted, they needed a foil for The Undertaker. They needed a lunatic to bring out the best in the dead man. The creation of a legend. By 1998, the Mankind-Undertaker feud had reached a plateau. They needed a catalyst. The concept of Hell in a Cell had been introduced, but Mick Foley wanted to elevate it. He wanted to do something that defied logic. He proposed starting the match on top of the cage, an idea that seemed like a punchline until he looked his peers in the eye and said, "I think I can do that." Jimmy Corderas, a member of the ring crew and referee at the time, remembers the atmosphere as being thick with the unknown. No one, not the fans, not the crew, and perhaps not even the participants, could have prepared for what was about to unfold. The fall and the fallout. The match began with a sequence that remains etched in the collective consciousness of every wrestling fan. As the two men climbed the structure, the crowd sensed the danger. Then the unthinkable happened. The Undertaker flung Mankind off the top of the cage, sending him crashing through the Spanish announce table 20 feet below. The sound was described as sickening. Jim Ross, on commentary, captured the horror of the moment, while backstage, the reaction was pure, unadulterated panic. Dr. Francois Petit, who served as a physician for the company, was rushed to the scene. He found a man who had not only taken a brutal fall, but had done so on a dislocated shoulder. And yet, in a display of sheer, baffling defiance, Mick Foley returned. As Terry Funk, his longtime associate, recalled, they were trying to buy time, trying to keep the match going, but Foley was a man possessed. He crawled back up that cage, driven by an almost pathological need to deliver a spectacle. Then came the second moment, the choke slam through the top of the cage. As Foley hit the mat, a heavy steel chair fell right behind him, striking his face. It was a moment of profound jeopardy. He was legitimately knocked unconscious. 42 seconds of lost memory. When he came to, he was a broken man, yet he was still working. He began pulling thumbtacks out of his skin, a grisly performance that, while terrifying, solidified his status as an icon. The price of greatness. Was it worth it? That is the question that haunts this documentary. We look at the long-term impact, the concussions, the chronic pain, the physical toll of putting the body through the equivalent of multiple car accidents for the sake of a pop from the crowd. Foley, speaking on the aftermath, admits that for years he harbored resentment. He felt like a one-hit wonder defined by one violent night. But as he reminisces with The Undertaker, he comes to realize that what they did that night would outlive them both. It was a moment of profound artistic expression, albeit one purchased with blood and bone. The medical reality of his career is sobering. Experts warn of the long-term effects of repeated head trauma, a topic that was not fully understood at the time of these matches. Today, his daughter, Noelle, watches her father with concern, noting that the fear of what the future holds for his health is a daily reality. A legacy written in scars. Mick Foley is a man who lived his dream, but he paid the price in currency that cannot be replaced. The Hell in a Cell match stands as a testament to the absolute commitment of two performers. But it also serves as a stark reminder of the limits of human endurance. As we close this chapter, we are left with a lingering reflection. The industry has evolved, and our understanding of safety has changed. But we cannot look back at that night in Pittsburgh without acknowledging the sheer, terrifying power of the spectacle. It was a dangerous, crazy masterpiece. And for all of us, the fans, the performers, the observers, it remains a moment that forces us to reconcile the beauty of the craft with the cold, hard reality of the cost. We are left to wonder, in a business built on the suspension of disbelief, how much of that disbelief is real, and how much of it is a sacrifice we're simply too afraid to fully quantify. The story of Mankind and The Undertaker is one of the most defining narratives in the history of the sport. A story of pain, of glory, and of a man who was willing to walk through hell just to hear the crowd roar. Welcome to a special edition of our investigative series. I am your host, and today, we pull back the curtain on one of the most harrowing chapters in the history of professional wrestling. We're looking at a night that defied logic, a moment that forever altered the landscape of the industry, and a cautionary tale that continues to resonate decades later. This is the story of Hell in a Cell. On June 28, 1998, at the World Wrestling Federation King of the Ring pay-per-view, the world witnessed a collision between The Undertaker and Mankind that transcended the boundaries of sports entertainment. It was a spectacle that hit the audience like a physical blow, a masterclass in controlled chaos that pushed two elite performers to the absolute edge and then tossed them right over. In the world of professional wrestling, we often talk about the suspension of disbelief. But as any veteran will tell you, while the drama may be scripted, gravity is never a lie. I have spent a lifetime analyzing this business, and I have seen many things that made me uneasy, but nothing quite like what unfolded in that Pittsburgh arena. To understand why a man would willingly walk into such a maelstrom, we have to understand the mind of Mick Foley. Mick was a man who felt a deep, overwhelming need to be accepted. He recalled a moment in his youth where, after a desperate leap onto a concrete floor, he realized he could command the attention of a room by making people feel a sense of shock or disgust. It was a realization that would become his hallmark. If he could not make them love him, he would make them unable to look away. Mick Foley, known to many as the hardcore legend, did not just perform. He survived. His career was built on a foundation of thumbtacks, barbed wire, and death matches in Japan, a far cry from the pristine, G-rated product the World Wrestling Federation was pushing at the time. When he arrived in the organization, Vince McMahon was initially skeptical, famously questioning his marketability. Yet, under the guidance of Jim Ross and the creative vision of the agents, the Mankind character was born. It was an unusual, disquieting persona, but one that demanded attention. The feud with The Undertaker had reached a plateau by 1998. Both men needed a spark. That spark arrived in the form of the Hell in a Cell match. It was a structure designed for containment, but in the minds of the performers, it became a stage for the impossible. Inspired by a joke from his military funk, Mick Foley proposed a radical idea, starting the match on top of the cage. When that night arrived, the atmosphere was thick with an uneasy anticipation. Nobody in that building, or watching at home, knew what to expect. As they climbed the cage, the reality of the danger became apparent. The structure groaned under the weight of two giants. Then, in a moment that remains etched in the memories of millions, The Undertaker threw Mankind from the top of the cell. Witnessing that fall felt like watching a car accident in slow motion. When he crashed through the announcer's table, there was an audible, collective gasp from the entire arena. Backstage, the mood turned from professional interest to genuine, visceral concern. We thought he was dead, but in a display of sheer, baffling resilience, Foley rose. He returned to the fray, pushed by an adrenaline-fueled commitment to the art of the reaction. The brutality did not end there. A subsequent chokeslam through the top of the cage resulted in a second, even more terrifying impact. This time, a heavy steel chair followed him down, striking him in the face. It was in this moment that the match crossed the line from a dangerous spectacle into a legitimate medical crisis. He was unconscious, his body unresponsive, and the match continued only through a desperate, improvised effort by those in the ring to buy time. In the aftermath, the toll was heavy. A dislocated jaw, a bruised kidney, multiple stitches, and lost teeth. Yet, for Mick Foley, this night sparked a career renaissance. It changed how the audience perceived him. He had laid his body on the line to give them something they had never seen before. However, we must ask the difficult question, was it worth it? The years that followed saw the industry grapple with the long-term consequences of such reckless abandon. The repeated concussions, the brain trauma, and the cumulative damage to the human frame are the hidden costs of that 15-minute spotlight. Many of those close to him, including his wife Colette and his children, watched with a mix of awe and terror as he continued to push past his limits, culminating in the brutal "I quit" match against The Rock just months later. Today, we know far more about the dangers of chronic traumatic encephalopathy and the devastating impact of repetitive head trauma. Mick Foley has transitioned from that man who would sacrifice everything for a pop to a man fighting to keep his own health and clarity as he ages. When we reflect on that night in Pittsburgh, we see a masterpiece of professional wrestling, but we also see a sobering reminder of the price of fame. The legacy of Hell in a Cell is twofold. It stands as one of the most iconic moments in sports history, and as a stark warning to those who follow. It is a story of a man who pursued a dream with such ferocity that he nearly broke himself to achieve it. And perhaps, in the end, that is the most human part of the entire ordeal. As we look back at the footage, seeing him touch the remains of that very cell years later, we are reminded that some scars never truly fade. The roar of the crowd is a powerful drug, but it is a fickle companion. The question remains, in a business built on pain and performance, when is the line drawn? And who decides when it is enough? Welcome to a deep dive into one of the most chilling, defining, and transformative moments in the history of professional wrestling. I am your guide through this dark, often misunderstood, and undeniably brutal corner of the industry. Today, we turn our gaze back to June 28, 1998, at the World Wrestling Federation King of the Ring pay-per-view. It was an evening that etched a permanent scar on the psyche of every fan who witnessed it. We're talking about The Undertaker versus Mankind in the Hell in a Cell match. When you speak about Hell in a Cell, you're talking about something that hits the consciousness like a mallet. It was an encounter between two talents who pushed the envelope not just until it was full, but until it fell completely off the edge. In our business, there is a common refrain: wrestling is predetermined. It is a spectacle. It is a show. But there is one thing you cannot fake, and that is gravity. As a seasoned observer, I have been frightened by many things in this business. But nothing quite prepared me for the sheer brutality of what transpired that night. It was a masterpiece of danger, but we have to ask ourselves, was it worth it? To understand the match, we must understand the man. Mick Foley, the hardcore legend, was searching for something he felt was missing from his own life. He was a man who, in his youth, was often teased, leading to an overwhelming, almost desperate need to be liked. He discovered that he had a unique power if he could not make people love him. Perhaps he could make them disgusted by him, and in that disgust, he would find their attention. He recalled a moment in college where he leaped off a bed onto a stuffed atom on a concrete floor, spitting out a blood concoction to shock his peers. He realized then that he could command a room. He needed that reaction. Mick Foley understood the psychology of the audience better than most. He knew that fans gravitated toward those who seemed out of control, those who defied the script. He developed the persona of Cactus Jack, a wild, unpredictable force of nature who seemed truly insane. But beneath the madness, there was a calculated mind. Mick spent hours consuming Japanese wrestling tapes, studying the realism and the way those athletes engaged with their surroundings, not just their opponents. He sought a mentor in the legendary Terry Funk, a man who could make the audience suspend disbelief in a heartbeat. Together, they engaged in violent, bloody, fiery death matches in Japan, creating a reputation for a man who would literally give his body to the craft. When he arrived at the World Wrestling Federation, the environment was vastly different. It was a polished, arguably bland, G-rated era. The leadership, including Vince McMahon, did not initially see the value in a man like Mick Foley. He was not considered marketable or attractive. It took a leap of faith from those who recognized his unique ability to connect with an audience. They crafted the character of Mankind, a persona that arguably only Mick could pull off. He was pulling his own hair out, losing himself in the role, and in doing so, he became the perfect foil for The Undertaker, one of the most significant stars in the history of the industry. The Undertaker and Mankind had already built a foundation across dozens of matches. But the character of Mankind had hit a plateau. They needed something more. At the King of the Ring in 1998, they decided to escalate the conflict with a concept that had only been seen once before. Hell in a Cell. The idea was simple but terrifying. Put a roof on the cage, ensure both men are inside, and only one comes out. When the idea was first proposed, it was groundbreaking. But then came the suggestion, almost as a joke from Terry Funk, that perhaps the match should start on top of the cage. Mick took that joke and turned it into reality. He was terrified of heights, yet he felt this was the way to ensure his legacy. He wasn't looking at this as a second act in his career. He was looking at it as a way to keep his head above water. When the bell rang, the world stood still. The sight of two men climbing to the top of that towering steel structure before the match even officially began sent a shiver through the audience. The fans, the commentators, even those backstage, were in the dark. They were watching something that defied logic. The cage, secured with simple zip ties, was never designed to hold the weight of two grown men in the middle of a war. When they began to trade blows, the structure groaned. Then came the moment that changed everything. The Undertaker threw Mankind from the top of the cage. He plummeted toward the Spanish announce table. A 20-foot drop that felt like it happened in slow motion, yet was over in a blink. The crash was sickening. The sound of a human body meeting a solid desk echoed through the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. It was not a wrestling move. It was a traumatic event. It looked like a car accident. We saw the fear in the eyes of everyone in the back. Even the medical staff, including the legendary Dr. Francois Petit, rushed to the scene. Mick was broken, but he was driven by that overwhelming need for the crowd's reaction. He refused to stay down. He returned to the ring, climbing back up that structure, an act that defied all medical wisdom. It was, as many later described, the moment that truly solidified his status as a star. But the worst was yet to come. The second act of this tragedy involved a choke slam through the top of the cell. This time, there was no softening the blow. Mick crashed through the wire mesh onto the solid mat below, a steel chair trailing behind him, striking him directly in the face. He was knocked out cold. He was motionless. The concern was absolute. Terry Funk, the man who had been his guide, even urged the Undertaker to strike him just to shift the focus, to buy time for the medical team to ensure Mick was still breathing. When Mick eventually came to, his face was a ruin. A tooth had been knocked out and, in a horrifying turn of events, had been forced into his nasal passage. He had a dislocated jaw, a bruised kidney, and a concussion. Yet in that state, he continued. He even famously crawled to ensure he was covered in thumbtacks to enhance the visual of the match. The match ended after 17 minutes, but the journey did not. The consequences of that night were profound. We learned that the body has a limit. While that night sparked a career renaissance for Mick, leading to a world championship just 6 months later, it also set him on a dangerous path. The pressure to live up to the hardcore legend persona was relentless. He continued to take risks, notably in the infamous I Quit match against The Rock, where he took 11 chair shots to the head. We now know, with the wisdom of hindsight and medical science, the true cost of such dedication. We understand the long-term effects of concussions, the terrifying reality of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CE. We have seen the impact on his family, the fear in his children's eyes as they watched their father seemingly destroy himself for entertainment. The question, was it worth it, is one that Mick himself has had to grapple with for years. In the aftermath, during those long years of recovery and reflection, Mick found himself in a dark place. He felt that the Hell in a Cell match was the only thing he was known for, that he had accomplished nothing else of value. It was only later, through conversations with The Undertaker, that he began to understand the magnitude of what they had created. That night, they had created a moment that would outlive them both. Looking back, we see a man who was willing to push the limits of human endurance because he loved the roar of the crowd. He loved the art, the drama, and the connection he forged with the people watching. He was an artist who chose a violent, unforgiving canvas. Today, he channels that energy into his spoken word shows, a different kind of performance, but one that keeps his mind sharp. When we look at the legacy of the Hell in a Cell match, we see it as both an epic success and a cautionary tale. We saw two athletes who pushed the envelope, and in doing so, they dodged bullets, not just one, but several. We are left with the image of a man who gave his heart and soul to a business that, at the time, did not fully understand the damage it was inflicting. It is a reminder that behind every spectacular moment, there is a human cost, a story of pain, sacrifice, and the relentless, perhaps irrational, desire to be remembered. That is the story of Mick Foley. And that is the story of the day we learned that in the world of wrestling, you cannot fake gravity. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a special presentation. I am your host, and today we are peeling back the curtain on one of the most harrowing chapters in the history of professional wrestling. We are diving deep into the archives, looking at the kind of stories that define legacies, stories of unparalleled resilience, dangerous ambition, and the heavy price of fame. Tonight, we analyze the night that changed the industry forever, June 28th, 1998, the night of the King of the Ring, where a steel structure known as Hell in a Cell became the stage for a moment that blurred the lines between scripted entertainment and life-threatening reality. When you look back at the encounter between The Undertaker and Mankind, you're not just looking at a wrestling match. You're looking at a masterclass in psychological warfare and physical endurance that pushed two human beings to the very edge of human limitation. According to those who were there, including the legendary Jim Ross and the man behind the mask himself, Mick Foley, this was a night where gravity refused to be faked. Let's set the scene. The Pittsburgh Civic Arena was electric, but underneath that tension was a calculated, albeit reckless, plan. Mick Foley, a performer who had built a career on the philosophy that if you cannot make people love you, you might make them stand in awe of your pain, had decided that this match needed to be a landmark. It was his career renaissance. For years, Vince McMahon had been hesitant about the marketability of Mick Foley. But inside that cell, Foley sought to prove that he was not just a performer. He was a phenomenon. The match began with a sequence that defied logic. They started on top of the cage. Think about that for a moment. 600 pounds of human weight suspended over the concrete floor, held up by thin, metallic zip ties. When that cage inevitably gave way, and Foley went plummeting through the air toward the Spanish announce table, the world stood still. It was a scene that felt like a car accident, a moment of pure, unadulterated horror. Those who witnessed it, the fans, the referees, the colleagues, all shared a single thought. He must be dead. But the story does not end there. In a display of what can only be described as superhuman stubbornness, or perhaps, as his daughter Noelle noted, an overwhelming need to be accepted, Foley returned. He climbed back up, and then came the choke slam through the top of the cell. As we analyze this from the perspective of a sports documentarian, we have to ask the difficult question: at what point does the pursuit of a reaction become a liability? According to the medical professionals and peers like Al Snow, Foley was not just selling a performance. He was absorbing the consequences of a concussion, a dislocated jaw, and a bruised kidney. He was, as they say, unconscious for over 40 seconds. Yet he continued. The aftermath of this match provides us with a sobering look at the professional wrestling industry of the 90s. We were in an era where the long-term effects of concussions, such as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, were not fully understood or prioritized. The journey of Mick Foley was paved with pain. From the infamous I Quit match against The Rock, where he endured 11 unprotected headshots, to the constant, grueling physical toll of his hardcore style. Was it worth it? That is the question that haunts the legacy of the hardcore legend. His wife, Colette, speaks with the perspective of someone who has watched her husband carry the weight of those 15 minutes in the spotlight for over 3 decades. There's a profound sadness in realizing that the very thing that made him a star, his willingness to die for a roar from the crowd, is the same thing that has left him paying a physical price today. Yet, there is also beauty in his reflection. When Foley visited the World Wrestling Entertainment warehouse years later and stood before the remains of that very cell, the tears were not just for the pain, but for the realization that he had created a moment that would outlive him. He had taken a canvas and painted it with his own blood, sweat, and tears to provide a performance that people would never forget. As we close this chapter, we are left to ponder the nature of the business. It is a world of smoke and mirrors, of character and persona, but the trauma is undeniably real. Mick Foley survived the cell, but he, like many who followed the same path, serves as a cautionary tale of what happens when the desire to be a legend outweighs the preservation of the self. It is a story of a man who needed to be needed, who found his voice in the wreckage, and who, even now, continues to search for ways to sharpen his mind while reconciling with the man he was in that ring. One has to wonder, as the echoes of that night in Pittsburgh continue to ripple through the annals of history, if we will ever see the likes of that again, and perhaps, for the sake of the men and women in the ring, it is better that we do not. What do you think? Looking back on the evolution of wrestling safety and the legacy of the hardcore legend, was the cultural impact of that night worth the physical toll that Mick Foley carries today? Welcome to the squared circle of history. I am your host, and tonight we are peeling back the layers of a legend, a night of infamy, and the cost of immortality in this business we call professional wrestling. On June 28th, 1998, At the King of the Ring pay-per-view, the landscape of our industry shifted forever. It was Undertaker versus Mankind in Hell in a Cell. To those who were there, to those who watched, it was a mallet to the consciousness. We knew it would be intense, but we did not know it would be that dangerous. We had two talents pushing the envelope until they fell right off the edge. As the saying goes, wrestling might be scripted, but you cannot script gravity. In my long tenure covering this industry, very little has truly frightened me. But that match? It stopped my heart. The legacy of Hell in a Cell is a duality. It is an epic success and, simultaneously, a harrowing cautionary tale. We watched, mesmerized and horrified, as Mick Foley endured an unrelenting onslaught. Until you saw it with your own eyes. You could not believe a human being could survive that kind of punishment. The pain was real. The drama was, and remains, chillingly real. As a commentator, I remember sitting there, screaming at the television, questioning why a man would subject himself to such destruction. When is it enough? When do we stop? You pay for the decisions you make in those 15 minutes in the spotlight for the rest of your life. It was a masterpiece of controlled chaos, but it forces us all to ask, was it worth it? To understand the man, you have to understand the void he was trying to fill. Mick Foley once noted that his pursuit of the World Wrestling Federation Championship was fueled by a need to be liked, a byproduct of a childhood spent being teased. He discovered a dark, potent power in the reaction of an audience, the realization that if he could not make them love him, he could certainly make them recoil in disgust. That was the birth of the hardcore legend. Mick Foley understood the psychology of the fans. He knew they were drawn to the uncontrollable, to the performer who broke the script. Alongside travel partner and close friend Al Snow, Foley cultivated his craft. He studied the Japanese style, where the story was not just man versus man, but man versus his environment. He found a mentor in the legendary Terry Funk, a man who could make the audience suspend disbelief in a heartbeat. Together, they engaged in violent, bloody, fiery death matches in Japan. Foley found his home in the chaos, back in the United States. Vince McMahon initially did not see a place for a performer like Foley in the World Wrestling Federation. The era was bland, and Foley's style did not align with the product. But Jim Ross, then Vice President of Talent Relations, saw something, a lunatic who could be the perfect foil for The Undertaker. And so, the character of Mankind was born from a vacuum. It was, as Gerald Briscoe noted, a bizarre concept that only a performer as committed as Foley could have pulled off. The Hell in a Cell concept itself was a milestone. Following the inaugural match between Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, Foley and The Undertaker were tasked with raising the bar. According to the accounts of those involved, it was Terry Funk who jokingly suggested the unthinkable, starting the match on top of the cell and being thrown off. Foley, however, was dead set on the idea. It was not a second act in his career. It was an attempt to keep his head above water. The atmosphere in the Pittsburgh Civic Arena on that night in June was electric. Jimmy Corderas, watching from the monitors as a producer, knew they were entering uncharted territory. When the bell rang, Foley did the unexpected. He climbed. He was terrified of heights, yet he climbed that structure, creating a fear of the mind that no one could escape. Then, the moment that defined a generation. The top of the cage gave way, and Foley was flung 20 feet through the air, crashing through the Spanish announce table. Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler watched in horror as a 300-pound human being descended upon them. It looked like a car accident. We truly believed he was dead. Yet, fueled by adrenaline, Foley continued. What followed was perhaps even more harrowing. During a choke slam, the cage mesh gave way unexpectedly, and Foley crashed onto the solid mat below, a heavy folding chair following him down and striking his face. It was the first time in his career he had been legitimately knocked out. The arena fell silent with concern. The referees, Dr. Francois and Terry Funk, swarmed the ring, uncertain if they were witnessing a match or a tragedy. Foley later recalled a 42-second window that he simply does not remember. Yet he rose. He continued the match, even finding a moment to pull a dislodged tooth from his nostril. He was committed to the pop, to the reaction that only pure, visceral suffering could elicit. The aftermath was a long, painful reality. He suffered a dislocated jaw, a bruised kidney, and countless stitches. Yet, that night sparked a career renaissance. Within 6 months, he was world champion. But the physical toll was profound. Years later, we understand the long-term impact of those repeated concussions, the constant threat of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. As we look back at the footage, even his own family struggles with the memory. His daughter, Noelle, and his wife, Colette, carry the weight of those moments, the fear that their father and husband was putting his life on the line for a 15-minute performance. Mick Foley lives with the legacy of that night. He has moved into the world of spoken word, finding new ways to stimulate his mind, keeping his intellect sharp as his body pays the price of his youth. He recognizes that he was his own worst enemy in the ring, driven by an insatiable need for the roar of the crowd. Was it worth it? That is a question only he can answer. He lived his dream, but he paid for it in flesh and blood. When he and The Undertaker revisited that old cell at the World Wrestling Federation warehouse years later, the man who survived hell in a cell wept. It was a visceral reminder of a time when the world offered him a canvas for surreal, sublime performance art, a magical, albeit dangerous, way to make a living. We are left with the image of a man who gave his heart and soul to this industry, leaving an indelible mark on history that will outlive us all. But as the lights dim on this chapter, we must reflect on the price of greatness. In the pursuit of the unreachable, how much of ourselves are we willing to sacrifice? Welcome to this special presentation. I am here to take you behind the curtain, into the shadows of an industry that has captivated millions, yet often left behind a trail of shattered bodies and haunting questions. We are dissecting one of the most polarizing nights in the history of professional wrestling, a night that defined a legend, tested the limits of human endurance, and left a scar on the soul of the business that has never truly faded. This is the story of Hell in a Cell. On June 28, 1998, at the World Wrestling Federation King of the Ring pay-per-view, a match occurred that would permanently etch itself into the collective consciousness of sports entertainment. The Undertaker versus Mankind. It was not merely a match. It was a collision that defied the laws of physics and the boundaries of sanity. To understand the magnitude of this encounter, you must understand the man at the center of the storm, Mick Foley. To his peers, he was the hardcore legend. To himself, he was a man driven by an overwhelming, almost insatiable need to be liked, a byproduct of a youth spent navigating the isolation of being teased. Foley realized early on that if he could not earn affection, he would command attention through sheer, visceral shock. As he would recount, his path to the ring was paved with an appetite for the extreme. He found his voice in the Japanese death matches, where the weaponry was sharp, the fires were real, and the pain was a currency he was willing to spend without hesitation. When he arrived in the World Wrestling Federation, he was an anomaly. Executives like Vince McMahon were, according to reports, initially skeptical of his marketability, viewing him as a performer who lacked the traditional polish of a superstar. Yet, he possessed an uncanny ability to read a crowd and a willingness to put his body on the line to forge a connection. Enter the Hell in a Cell. Following the success of the inaugural match between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, a contest widely considered a technical masterpiece, the pressure was on. Mick Foley and The Undertaker sought to elevate the concept. According to those involved, The idea to begin the match on top of the cage was born from a conversation with fellow wrestler Terry Funk. It was suggested as a joke, but for Foley, it became an obsession. When the two men stood atop that structure in Pittsburgh, the reality of the danger was palpable. The mesh, secured only by zip ties, was never designed to hold the weight of two men in a physical struggle. As they began to move, the structure groaned. Then it gave way. What followed is one of the most iconic and terrifying moments in television history. Foley was flung from the top of the cell, crashing through the Spanish announce table nearly 20 feet below. The sound was unmistakable, a sickening thud that silenced a packed arena. For a moment, the world stopped. Fans, officials, and even the commentary team were left to wonder if they had just witnessed a tragedy. Yet, in a display of resilience that borders on the unfathomable, the match did not end. Foley returned. He climbed back up. The carnage continued, leading to a second, even more violent spot where a choke slam through the top of the cage sent him plummeting toward the ring floor. This time, a heavy steel chair followed him down, striking his face with terrifying force. The aftermath was a cocktail of chaos. Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious. There were accounts of a tooth being knocked out and forced through his nasal passage. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was one of genuine horror. Medical personnel and peers rushed to the ring, fearing for his life. Yet, the match dragged on until the final bell. The fallout of that night served as both a career renaissance for Foley and a brutal cautionary tale. He would go on to win the World Wrestling Federation Championship, but the cost was staggering. His body had been subjected to the equivalent of multiple high-speed automobile accidents. Years later, as the medical community began to better understand the long-term impacts of concussions and repetitive brain trauma, the legacy of that night became even more complex. Foley himself has navigated the aftermath of his career with introspection. He has spoken about the fine line between the thrill of the roar of the crowd and the reality of the toll his body has paid. He has dealt with the physical and mental consequences of a life lived in the extreme, admitting that while the art he created was profound, the risks he took were of a magnitude that today's industry might not and should not allow. As we look back at the wreckage and the glory of the Hell in a Cell, we are forced to confront the fundamental question that lies at the heart of the dark side of the ring. Was it worth it? Foley often reflects on the moments where he stood in the ring, bathed in the adulation of thousands and the quiet, heavy reality of the home life that followed. There is a melancholy there, a recognition that for all the championship belts and the legendary status, the true price was paid in the quiet of a room long after the cameras had stopped rolling. The industry has evolved. The standards of safety have shifted. Yet, the images from that June night in 1998 remain. They serve as a testament to the sheer, stubborn will of a man who wanted to be remembered, and the heavy burden that comes with the pursuit of a legacy written in blood and steel. As we close this chapter, we are left not with an answer, but with a reflection on the human cost of spectacle. We witness a performer who found his purpose in the extreme and an audience that, for better or worse, demanded he push past the edge. The story of Mick Foley in the Hell in a Cell is not just a match report. It is a profound look at the choices we make for the things we love, and the price we are willing to pay to be felt by the world. Welcome to the Squared Circle. I am your host, and today we are peeling back the curtain on one of the most harrowing, transcendent, and controversial chapters in the history of professional wrestling. We're talking about the night that changed everything. The night when the line between performance art and genuine tragedy blurred into nothingness. This is the story of Hell in a Cell, the anatomy of a masterpiece. On the 28th of June, 1998, at the King of the Ring pay-per-view, the world witnessed a collision that defied the laws of physics and common sense. It was The Undertaker versus Mankind. It was Hell in a Cell. In this business, we often hear that it is a performance, a scripted spectacle. But as anyone who has spent years in the trenches of the industry will tell you, you can fake a lot of things, but you cannot fake gravity. When two talents like Mick Foley and The Undertaker decide to push the envelope until it falls over the edge, they do not just push it, they shatter it. The drive for acceptance. To understand the carnage, you have to understand the man. Mick Foley was not the typical WWE superstar of that era. He was a man who, in his own words, spent his life feeling like he was missing something. He was teased in his youth, and he carried a desperate, overwhelming need to be liked. Or, if he could not be liked, to be noticed. I remember the tales told by those close to him. During his college days, he would execute leaps onto concrete, spitting out mixtures to simulate blood, just to see the horrified reactions of his peers. He realized early on that if he could not earn love, he would earn disgust, anything to get a reaction. That hunger brought him to the ring, where he eventually crafted the persona of Cactus Jack, and later, the iconic Mankind, the creation of a cage. By 1998, The Undertaker was already a titan, but his matches were often against giants, which lacked the frenetic energy needed to elevate the product. Jim Ross, then the vice president of talent relations, and others in the backstage machine were looking for a spark. The concept of Hell in a Cell was born from a desire for something different, a roof cage where there was no escape. When Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker first stepped into that structure, it was a milestone. But when the time came for Foley and The Undertaker to follow up, Foley did not want to just match it. He wanted to change the sport forever. According to the accounts of those involved, the idea to start the match on top of the cage came from a seemingly casual, perhaps joking, suggestion by Terry Funk. Mick Foley, driven by that internal fire to make his mark, took that joke and turned it into his reality. He was not looking for a second act. He was looking to keep his head above water. The descent. As the match began in the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, the fans were stunned. The sight of two men climbing to the top of that massive steel structure was unheard of. The structural integrity of the cage was never meant to hold two men of their combined weight, some 600 pounds. And as the zip ties began to pop, the reality of the danger became apparent to everyone watching. Then it happened. In a moment that felt like slow motion, The Undertaker hurled Mick Foley from the top of the cage through the announcer's table below. The sound of that impact, the sickening, hollow thud of a human body meeting the surface, is a sound that stays with you. Those of us in the industry, watching from monitors, felt the collective terror. It was not wrestling anymore. It was a scene from a car accident. The refusal to quit. Any sane individual would have ended the match there. But Foley was not, at that moment, operating under the rules of sanity. Driven by a commitment to the audience and his own legend, he refused to stay down. He climbed back up, and he took more. The second major spot, a chokeslam that sent him through the mesh, was the moment the collective heart of the industry stopped. Foley was genuinely knocked unconscious. There was a 42-second window where he was not there. The silence in the arena, followed by the frantic concern of the staff and the medical personnel, told the story better than any play-by-play commentary ever could. According to reports from the medical staff present, Foley suffered a dislocated jaw, a bruised kidney, and multiple lost teeth, among other injuries. Yet he continued. He even famously incorporated a thumbtack spot into the final minutes of the match. The aftermath and the cost. Was it worth it? That is the question that haunts this entire narrative. Mick Foley's wife, Colette, spoke of the deep worry that came with watching the man she loved subject his body to such extremes. His daughter, Noelle, reflects on the trauma of seeing her father pushed to the brink on television, unaware of what was real and what was performance. The long-term effects of such brutality are undeniable. We now know much more about chronic traumatic encephalopathy and the cumulative damage of repetitive head trauma. Foley himself has been forced to grapple with the reality that his career, while legendary, came a steep physical price, a cautionary legacy. Today, Hell in a Cell remains an epic success in terms of spectacle and a cautionary tale in terms of humanity. It launched Foley into a new stratosphere of fame. He became a world champion shortly after, but it also highlighted the dangerous threshold of human endurance. As we look back at the footage, we see a man who is willing to give everything for the roar of the crowd. It is a testament to the power of the medium, but also a stark reminder of the limits that should never be crossed. Mick Foley survived that night. He lived his dream, and he carved his name into the bedrock of wrestling history. But as he now looks back at the structure that made him a legend, he does so with the perspective of a man who understands that there is no reward big enough to justify the loss of one's future. The story of Hell in a Cell is the story of a man who climbed the mountain, fell, and climbed again, just to hear his cheer. And long after the echoes of those cheers have faded, the question remains for all of us. At what point do we stop the match, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to a special deep dive investigation. I am your host, and today we pull back the curtain on one of the most harrowing, iconic, and debated chapters in the history of professional wrestling. We are talking about the night that changed everything, the night the boundaries of physical possibility were shattered. On June 28, 1998, at the World Wrestling Federation King of the Ring pay-per-view, a match took place that would forever be etched in our collective consciousness. The Undertaker versus Mankind, inside the Hell in a Cell. To understand this, you have to understand the philosophy of the man known as the hardcore legend, Mick Foley. For Foley, wrestling was about connection. It was about filling a void, a lifelong need to be liked, to be validated. As he famously put it, if he could not make people love him, he would make them react, even if it meant disgusting them. That pursuit led him down a path of extreme, visceral violence. He wanted the pop, the gasp, the oh my God, and he was willing to pay any price to get it. When we look back at that night in the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, we see a collision of two forces. You had The Undertaker, a towering giant and a pillar of the industry, and Mick Foley, a man who viewed his own body as a canvas for surreal, sublime performance art. The plan for that match, as recounted by those involved, was a departure from the norm. Foley, inspired by a joke from his mentor Terry Funk about starting on top of the cell, decided that this would be the spot. He was going to fall. He was going to take the dive. Now, imagine being a producer or an agent backstage. You have two men who are essentially agreeing to defy the laws of physics. When the match began and they climbed to the top of that cold, steel structure, the atmosphere shifted. It was no longer just a match. It was a scene of genuine, mounting terror. When Mankind was thrown from the top of the cage and plummeted through the Spanish announce table, the world stopped. It was not a choreographed move. It was a car wreck. The sound of the crash, the silence that followed, and the sight of a man lying motionless, it was harrowing. Backstage, the mood was one of pure shock. Many thought it was over. Many thought they had just witnessed a tragedy. But Foley did not stay down. Driven by that unyielding commitment to the audience and his own legend, he climbed back up. And that is where the cautionary tale turns into a masterpiece of chaos. The second major spot, the chokeslam through the top of the cell, was not what anyone anticipated. Foley fell, and a heavy folding chair followed, striking him with brutal force. He was, by all accounts, legitimately knocked out. Dr. Francois Petit, the ringside physician, found a man who was not there. The physical toll was immense: a dislocated jaw, a bruised kidney, teeth knocked into his nasal passage, and a concussion that left him with blank spots in his memory. Yet, the match continued. Why? Because in that era, the show went on. The pain was real, the blood was real, and the danger was constant. When the dust finally settled, the legacy of that night was cemented. It made Mick Foley a star, but it also raised the haunting question: Was it worth it? The aftermath was long. We saw the fallout in subsequent matches, like the I Quit match against The Rock, where the excessive use of headshots resulted in real-world brain trauma. Family members, including his daughter Noelle and his wife Colette, watched in horror as the line between professional theater and physical destruction blurred into something truly dangerous. Today, we know much more about the long-term effects of concussions and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. We know that the price paid for those 15 minutes in the spotlight can last a lifetime. Foley himself has spoken openly about the resentment he once felt being defined by one match, and the long journey toward embracing his legacy. Looking back, we are left to ponder the nature of the business. It was a time when the stakes were pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance. While those moments of intensity created a bond between the performer and the audience that few can claim, the cost was the physical well-being of the athlete. As we reflect on the career of a man who survived the cell, we must ask ourselves, are we watching a sport, a performance, or a desperate act of human sacrifice? The answers remain as complex as the man himself. Mick Foley lived his dream, but he also serves as a stark reminder of the thin, razor-sharp line between the roar of the crowd and the silence of the aftermath. Was it worth it? Perhaps that is a question that can never truly be answered, only lived with. Welcome back, everyone. I am your guide through the shadows, the untold chapters, and the seismic moments that define the history of professional wrestling. Today, we are reopening a file that every devotee of this industry knows by heart. A night in June of 1998 at the King of the Ring pay-per-view, where the line between staged artistry and mortal peril was completely erased. That was the night of Hell in a Cell. The Undertaker versus Mankind. When you say the name Hell in a Cell, people don't just remember a steel structure. They remember a sledgehammer to the consciousness. Wrestling may be scripted, it may be theater, but you cannot script gravity. That is the cold, hard truth that those involved had to grapple with. Even to this day, its legacy persists as a haunting cautionary tale. According to those present, they were pushing the envelope until it fell off the edge. Mick Foley, the man known as the hardcore legend, entered that match with an overwhelming need to be accepted. As Mick himself shared back in his college days, he would perform reckless leaps just to garner a reaction, whether it was disgust or adoration. To Mick, wrestling was not just a job. It was the vehicle for the connection he felt missing in his own life. Look at the landscape of that era. The World Wrestling Federation was in a phase many considered bland, a stark contrast to the bloody, violent style Mick had experienced in Japan. Vince McMahon, according to various reports, did not initially want Mick Foley on a roster, believing he lacked marketability. It took persistent advocacy from Jim Ross to get Mick that chance on the biggest stage of them all. Thus, the character of Mankind was born, a bizarre, unhinged persona willing to do anything to make a mark. That Hell in a Cell match was not some spontaneous improvisation. According to the records, it was a sequence of calculated, dangerous decisions. When Terry Funk joked, "Why not start on top of the cell?" Mick Foley did not laugh. He saw an opening, a chance to carve out a place in history, or perhaps to pay for it with his life. The image of Mick Foley being hurled from the top of the cage through the announce table remains one of the most shocking visuals in the history of televised sports. The sound, that crash, the stunned silence of the arena, it became a symbol of terrifying reality. According to those backstage, they truly believed he had perished. Friends, family, and colleagues were forced to witness a scene no one wants to see. A man lying motionless after a fall of nearly 20 feet onto the unforgiving floor. But the story did not end there. The insanity peaked when Mick Foley, despite being severely injured, insisted on climbing back to the top of the structure, a decision that doctors and colleagues still struggle to comprehend. It forces us to ask why. When is enough enough? according to the accounts of the medical staff and those in attendance. That match devolved into a desperate fight for survival. The chairs, the thumbtacks, the total destruction, all were tools used to elicit a response from the crowd. That was the price of fame in the high-stakes world of professional wrestling. Mick achieved his goal. He became a world champion, but the cost was astronomical. Years later, when we look back, we must face the fallout. Concussions, chronic pain, and the looming specter of traumatic brain injury have become the shadows cast over many legends. When Mick Foley touched that same cage years later in a warehouse and broke down in tears, we understood that this was not mere sentimentality. It was an honest confrontation with a chapter of his life that changed him forever. As we close this file, we are left to ponder the ultimate question: was the sacrifice worth it? Was the pain, the blood, and the risk justified by the spectacle? Or was it just the inevitable consequence of a craft that demands its performers reach toward the absolute limits of human endurance? Mick Foley survived Hell in a Cell, but the memory of that night remains etched in the minds of everyone who witnessed it, a permanent reminder that behind the glimmer of championship gold lies a vast ocean of sacrifice that no spotlight can ever truly illuminate. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the story of a legend and the story of the price of passion. Join me next time as we continue to decode the darkest fragments of professional wrestling. Welcome to the ring. I am ready to step into the role of the veteran wrestling commentator, capturing the raw, haunting, and visceral reality of that fateful night in June of 1998. Here is the chronicle of the Hell in a Cell, as told through the lens of history. The Architect of Pain, a dark side of the ring special. On June 28, 1998, at the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring pay-per-view, a single match carved its name into the bedrock of wrestling history: The Undertaker versus Mankind. Inside the unforgiving steel of Hell in a Cell. Hell in a Cell hits you like a mallet to the consciousness. It was designed to be a structure of finality, but what we witnessed was something else entirely. We had two performers who possessed a dangerous propensity to push the envelope until it fell right. Off the edge of the world. In this business, they say wrestling is staged, a theatrical performance, but there is one thing you can never fake: gravity. I've been unsettled by many things in this industry, but nothing gripped me with the same cold terror as that night. What left the world stunned was the unrelenting, almost incomprehensible punishment endured by Mick Foley. Until you saw it with your own eyes, your mind refused to accept that a human being could sustain that level of physical trauma and survive. This was not a performance. The pain was visceral, the drama was genuine, and for those of us watching, the reaction was pure, unfiltered disbelief. We were screaming, cursing, calling him an absolute lunatic. We were forced to ask the question that haunts the legacy of that match to this day. Why? Was it worth it? Everyone who enters this world is searching for something missing in their own lives. For Mick Foley, it was an overwhelming need to be accepted. He recalled a time in his youth, during his sophomore year of college, when he performed a leap off a bed onto a stuffed object on a concrete floor, spitting out a concoction of red food coloring to mimic blood. When he heard a spectator call it the most disgusting thing they had ever seen, he didn't recoil. He felt power. If he could not be loved, he would be remembered. He would be feared. He would be the hardcore legend. Foley's style was not typical of the World Wrestling Federation's product of that era, which was largely sterile and bland. He was a man who thrived on realism. He admitted that he didn't feel like he had truly wrestled unless he was struggling to walk back to his hotel room afterward. His wife, Colette, who has been by his side for over 35 years, saw the gentleman beneath the persona, but she also understood his drive. When the adrenaline pumped, Mick needed the crowd to leave in a state of shock. and he was willing to sacrifice his body to ensure they would never forget his name. He developed personas like Cactus Jack, a wild, unpredictable force of nature. Jim Cornette, who served as a producer during that era, noted that Foley had a master's grasp of ring psychology. He knew that fans are drawn to the out-of-control, the ones who break the script. In the cramped, dimly lit rooms of his early career, Foley spent hours studying Japanese tapes, observing the brutal, bloody death matches that would eventually become his calling card. He was looking for a place where he could stand out, and he found it in a style where the goal was not just to defeat an opponent, but to defeat the environment itself. When he arrived in the World Wrestling Federation, Vince McMahon was initially skeptical. He did not see a marketable star. But Jim Ross, then the vice president of talent relations, saw something unique in the man. He needed a dancing partner for The Undertaker, someone who could bring a dangerous, chaotic energy to the ring. And so, the character of Mankind was born, a bizarre, haunting figure pulled from the shadows. By the time King of the Ring 1998 arrived, Foley and The Undertaker had a foundation built on months of grueling matches. But Foley knew his character had reached a plateau. He needed to do something drastic. The concept of hell in a cell, a cage with a roof, had been introduced earlier, but it was a milestone moment. Then, in a casual conversation with Terry Funk, the idea was planted. What if the match began on top of the cage? What if, in a moment of sheer madness, he was thrown off? Foley became obsessed with the idea. He pitched it to Vince McMahon and The Undertaker. Though they were hesitant, terrified, even Foley was resolute. He wasn't looking at this as a second act in his career. He was looking at it as a way to keep his head above water, to do something that would cement his legacy. The Pittsburgh Civic Arena was packed that night, with 16,000 fans waiting for a spectacle. As the match began, nobody expected to see the competitors scale the structure before the bell had even rung. Foley, who admitted he was deathly afraid of heights, forced himself to climb. The mesh beneath them groaned and buckled under 600 pounds of human weight. Then, the moment that defined a generation occurred, in a scene that felt like it unfolded in slow motion. The Undertaker flung a 300-pound human being from the top of the cage. The crash into the announcer's table was deafening. Backstage, the atmosphere was one of pure horror. Everyone assumed the match was over, or worse, that life had been extinguished. But in a display of sheer, stubborn will, Foley rose. He was not finished. Against the frantic pleas of his friends and the medical staff, he climbed back up. The second spot, a chokeslam that sent him through the top of the cage and onto the hard mat. Below, left him legitimately unconscious for 42 seconds. The sight of him lying motionless, with a chair falling onto his face, remains one of the most chilling images in the history of the industry. He was a broken man that night, a dislocated jaw, a bruised kidney, multiple stitches, and teeth knocked out, one of which had been lodged in his nasal passage. Yet, in the aftermath, this match became a catalyst for his career. Within 6 months, the man nobody wanted was the world champion. However, the legacy of that night is a double-edged sword. Years of concussions, the brutal "I quit" match against The Rock, and the constant demand to over-deliver took a heavy toll. Today, we are left to grapple with the reality of chronic traumatic encephalopathy and the long-term consequences of such extreme sacrifice. Mick Foley is a man who lived his dream, but he paid the price for it. He created a masterpiece of pain, a moment that will outlive us all. But as we look back at the broken cage and the broken body, we are left with the same question he now asks himself. Was it worth it? For the fans, he is a legend who gave his heart and soul. For the man himself, it is a complex tapestry of pride and regret. He is a survivor of the cell, a man who searched for acceptance in the roar of the crowd, and who found it at the cost of everything. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a retrospective look into the darkness, the kind of darkness that looms behind the spectacle of professional wrestling. I have sat ringside for decades, witnessing the rise and fall of icons. But few moments in this industry have seared themselves into the collective consciousness quite like the events of June 28th, 1998. At the King of the Ring pay-per-view, we witnessed a collision that defied logic, safety, and perhaps even sanity. The Undertaker versus Mankind, inside the unforgiving steel structure known as Hell in a Cell. To understand this match is to understand the man behind the mask, Mick Foley. The genesis of the hardcore legend. Mick Foley was not the prototypical superstar Vince McMahon initially wanted. In an era that leaned toward the polished and the spectacular, Foley was an outlier. He was a man driven by an overwhelming, almost desperate need to be accepted. He once recalled that, as a college student, he would perform reckless stunts just to elicit a reaction, any reaction, from his peers. He learned early on that if he could not make people love him, he could make them gasp. Foley found his home in the brutal, visceral style of Japanese wrestling, eventually becoming the hardcore legend. Alongside mentors like Terry Funk, he embraced a lifestyle of thumbtacks, barbed wire, and explosives. He wasn't just wrestling, he was conducting a masterclass in pain. When he finally arrived in the World Wrestling Federation, he was a puzzle that producers struggled to solve. It was only through the creation of the Mankind persona, a broken, deranged soul, that he finally connected with the audience. The cage that changed everything. By June of 1998, the rivalry between The Undertaker and Mankind had plateaued. They needed a new, terrifying landscape to push their narrative forward. They turned to the Hell in a Cell concept. The match began with a decision that defied all tactical wisdom. Both men started on top of the cage. As the mesh groaned under their collective weight, nearly 600 pounds of human force, their structural integrity failed. Then came the moment that, even decades later, leaves viewers paralyzed with disbelief. The Undertaker hurled Mankind from the top of the 20-foot structure, sending him crashing through the Spanish announce table below. It was a scene reminiscent of a horrific car accident. For a fleeting, agonizing moment, the entire arena fell silent. We weren't watching a match anymore. We were watching a human being gamble with his life. The cost of the spotlight. What makes this story a true cautionary tale is what happened next. Against all medical advice and common sense, Mick Foley stood up. He climbed back up to the top of that cell. He refused to stay down. As the match continued, a chokeslam sent him through the top of the cage and into the ring, where a steel chair followed him, impacting his face with sickening force. He was legitimately knocked unconscious. He lost teeth, one of which reportedly traveled through his nasal passage. Yet, in a testament to the strange, addictive nature of this business, he continued. He wanted the pop. He wanted the roar of the crowd. He was, in his own words, part of the pain. The legacy of the fall. Was it worth it? That is the question that haunts the legacy of Hell in a Cell. While it transformed Mick Foley into a global icon and sparked a career renaissance, it exacted a heavy toll. Foley suffered from repeated concussions, a dislocated jaw, and years of physical decay. His family lived through the terror of wondering if their father would survive the night. Following this, Foley went on to push his body even further, notably in the I Quit match against The Rock, where he endured 11 unprotected chair shots. These were not just athletic feats. They were instances of brain trauma presented as entertainment. Today, we look back at this as a defining moment in wrestling history, a dangerous, crazy masterpiece that established the standard for the Attitude Era. But for the men who stepped into that ring, it served as a brutal reminder of the limits of human endurance. Mick Foley eventually came to terms with his legacy, finding peace in the realization that what he and The Undertaker created would outlive them both. However, as we peel back the layers of this story, we are left to ponder the price of the roar. When does the performance end and the tragedy begin? We may never have a definitive answer, only the scars that remain. Welcome back to the program. I am your host, and today we are stepping into one of the darkest, most dramatic, and haunting chapters in the history of professional wrestling. We're going to deconstruct and analyze an event that has left even those involved questioning the cost of glory. Let us cast our minds back to June 28, 1998, at the King of the Ring pay-per-view. A match occurred that would forever change the landscape of this industry. The Undertaker versus Mankind in Hell in a Cell. It was a match, a milestone, and a chilling cautionary tale for anyone chasing the spotlight at any cost. According to those directly involved, Hell in a Cell did not just feel like a match. It hit like a mallet to the consciousness. Those present, including seasoned veterans, admitted that they witnessed the limits of human endurance being shattered in the most brutal fashion. In the world of wrestling, we can choreograph scripts and performances, but there is one thing that cannot be faked: gravity. Mick Foley, known as the hardcore legend, entered that match with a burning need, the overwhelming desire to be liked. Foley shared that ever since he was a young man, he had a desperate need for validation, even if it meant disgusting the audience to get a reaction. From his high-risk leaps during his college days to the bloody death matches in Japan involving thumbtacks, fire, and barbed wire, Foley's style was a testament to his willingness to sacrifice his own body to command attention. As his daughter, Noelle Foley, shared, her father truly loved the sound of the crowd gasping in shock at what he would do. But in the World Wrestling Federation at that time, this style was not exactly a product they were selling. Vince McMahon, the head of the empire, did not initially believe Mick Foley was marketable. It took the persistence of Jim Ross, a veteran talent executive, to give Foley a shot on the big stage. Under the persona of Mankind, he became the perfect foil for The Undertaker. When the concept of Hell in a Cell was being developed, Mick Foley and his mentor, Terry Funk, came up with a wild idea: start the match on top of the cage. It was a pitch that gave even The Undertaker and Vince McMahon pause. Nobody knew how far this would go or how dangerous it would eventually become. When a match officially began at the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, the air was thick with tension. Two giants climbed to the top of the steel structure, and then the moment of destiny arrived. The Undertaker threw Mick Foley from a height of nearly 20 feet down through the Spanish announce table. The sound of that crash is something many still find haunting to this day. Those at the announce desk, including Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler, were left stunned. This was no longer just professional wrestling. It looked like a catastrophic car accident happening before our very eyes. But the most frightening aspect was that Mick Foley stood back up. After being tended to by medical personnel, he made the unthinkable decision to climb back up to the top of the cell. Those watching backstage were in a state of panic. They asked themselves, when is enough enough? When does this stop? The nightmare continued when a choke slam sent Mick Foley through the roof of the cage, crashing onto the ring mat below, with a heavy steel chair following him down and striking him in the face. It was the first time in his career that Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious. Those on the scene, including Dr. Francois Petit, feared this might be the end for him. Yet, through sheer, almost incomprehensible willpower, Foley finished the match. Years later, when we look back, we must ask ourselves about the true price of glory. The scars, the lost teeth, the repeated concussions. These were the prices paid for those 15 minutes in the spotlight. Foley has since admitted to the severe health repercussions he faces, including the risks associated with chronic traumatic encephalopathy due to repeated brain trauma. Yet, that match changed Foley's career forever. From an underdog deemed unmarketable, he rose to become a world champion within months. As his family has confided, they lived in constant fear every time he stepped into that ring. They wondered, was this sacrifice worth it? The story of Mick Foley and Hell in a Cell is not just about breathtaking stunts. It is a harsh lesson about the human drive for acceptance, the brutality of the entertainment industry, and the thin line between a legend and a tragedy. Looking back at that legacy, we see a man who poured his heart and soul into his craft, even as it took a devastating toll on his well-being. Ultimately, we are left to wonder if he had known the consequences. Would he have walked that same path again? That is a question only Mick Foley can answer. But the echoes of that night will resonate in the hearts of wrestling fans across the globe forever. Welcome back. As a veteran commentator who has lived through the rise and fall of the industry's most legendary stars, I understand exactly the tone you're looking for. I have adapted the previously established script into English, maintaining that high stakes, investigative, and deeply human storytelling style characteristic of the most acclaimed sports documentaries. Here is the narrative translated and refined for that authentic American sports journalism feel. Welcome back to the show. I am your host for this journey into the archives of wrestling's most haunting chapters. On June 28, 1998, at the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring pay-per-view, one match would cement its place in history as perhaps the most shocking spectacle the industry had ever witnessed. It was the Hell in a Cell match between The Undertaker and Mankind. Hell in a Cell hits you like a mallet to the consciousness. Those of us who were there, who saw it unfold, knew it was going to be intense. But no one could have anticipated that the carnage would push past every conceivable boundary. Wrestling is a scripted art form, but you cannot script the laws of gravity. What left the audience and the world stunned was the unrelenting punishment Mick Foley endured, until you saw it with your own eyes. You could not believe that a human being could physically survive such an ordeal. The match was real. The pain was real. The drama was quite simply undeniable. According to those behind the scenes, the atmosphere in the production truck and at ringside was one of pure horror. Veteran producers and fellow performers were screaming, asking why he would subject himself to such destruction. It was a dangerously crazy masterpiece, but it serves as a sobering cautionary tale. It forces us to ask, when does the pursuit of the spotlight demand too much from the human body? Mick Foley, known to the world as the hardcore legend, has been open about his motivations. From his college days, he sought ways to elicit a visceral reaction from an audience. He realized that if he could not make people love him, he would make them recoil in disgust. For Foley, realism was his greatest tool. He didn't feel he had performed well unless he was so beaten that he could barely walk back to his hotel room. Jim Cornette, a brilliant mind in the business, noted that Foley's mastery of in-ring psychology was unmatched. He understood that fans were drawn to chaos, to the performer who broke the rules and discarded the script. But beneath that, there was a profound sense of commitment. Colette Foley, who has known Mick for over 35 years, described him as a gentle, humorous man who nonetheless felt compelled to put his well-being on the line just to ensure the fans walked away talking about an unforgettable show. In 1998, the World Wrestling Federation was a different beast, a G-rated era that lacked the edge of the modern age. Jim Ross, then the Vice President of Talent Relations, recalls that Vince McMahon was initially hesitant to sign Foley, viewing him as unmarketable. Yet, through raw grit and sheer force of will, Foley turned the Mankind character into a legendary foil for The Undertaker. The concept of Hell in a Cell was born from a casual, almost joking suggestion. Terry Funk, Foley's mentor and partner, joked that it would be funny if the match started on top of the cell. That joke became an obsession. Despite a genuine fear of heights, Foley pitched the idea to The Undertaker and Vince McMahon. He was committed to the vision, no matter the cost. When a match began at the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, it defied all expectations. The zip ties holding the cell roof together could not withstand the weight of two massive men. when The Undertaker threw Foley from the top of the cage through the announcer's table. The sound of the impact sent a shockwave through the entire arena. It was like witnessing a horrific car accident. Everyone believed it was over. But then, Foley rose. Despite a dislocated shoulder, a shattered jaw, and teeth that had been knocked into his nasal passage, he continued. The sight of him fighting back, of his refusal to stay down, changed the trajectory of his career forever. According to those involved, the aftermath was just as intense. Backstage, Vince McMahon approached Foley, thanking him for his contributions, but demanding a promise that he would never attempt such a feat again. The medical toll was staggering: 15 stitches, 2 lost teeth, a dislocated jaw, and a bruised kidney that pained him for weeks. Yet that night was a catalyst. 6 months later, Mick Foley would reach the summit of the industry as world champion. However, the bill eventually comes due. The repetitive concussions, the trauma, and the long-term health risks have cast a long shadow. Doctors have warned him of the dangers of his past. His daughter, Noelle Foley, has had to witness the physical price her father pays for his dedication. Even the infamous I Quit match against The Rock, where he took 11 unprotected chair shots, remains a painful memory for his family. Today, Mick Foley continues to navigate the consequences of his career. He finds solace in the stage, using spoken-word performances to keep his mind sharp and engaged. For him, those years were surreal, sublime form of performance art. He lived his dream and made his mark. When looking back, both Foley and The Undertaker recognized that what they did that night would outlive them both. It is a defining piece of their legacy. But we are still left with a lingering question. Was it worth it? Perhaps the answer lies not in the morality of the act, but in the heart and soul of a performer who was willing to give everything to create a moment of genuine awe. A match, a legacy, and a timeless lesson on the limits of human endurance. Thank you for joining me for this look back at the dark side of the ring. I have crafted this script to capture the gravity of the events while strictly adhering to the facts and the tone you requested. I am ready to assist with any further analysis or documentation you require. Would you like me to delve into any other specific aspects of this story? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. I am your host, and today, we're going to peel back the curtain on one of the most polarizing and earth-shattering chapters in the history of professional wrestling. We have spent decades witnessing legendary performances, stories of glory and tragedy. But there are moments, matches that go beyond mere entertainment. They are grim reminders of the price paid for fame. Today, we are looking back at the Hell in a Cell event on June 28, 1998, at the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring. It was the showdown between The Undertaker and Mankind, a match that redefined the limits of human endurance. When discussing Hell in a Cell, people often use words like masterpiece. But according to the mentioned sources, it was also a cautionary tale. It was a match where, as many have admitted, we were lucky to dodge several bullets. According to Mick Foley, the man known as the hardcore legend, the burning desire for validation was his primary motivator. He recounts how, during his college years, he would perform daredevil stunts on concrete floors just to provoke a reaction from the crowd. Foley shared that if he could not make people love him, he would make them disgusted. To him, that was the only way to remain etched in the audience's mind. His wife, Colette Foley, who has known him for over 35 years, saw a gentle soul behind that violent persona. She understood his commitment, but she also saw the terrifying risks that came with it. Jim Cornette, an insider at the time, observed that Mick Foley was a master of psychology. He understood that fans crave performers who went against the script. But when we put ourselves in the shoes of Vince McMahon, who initially did not see the marketability in Foley, we see a larger picture. The clash between a man who wanted to shatter every barrier and a corporation seeking to build a brand around something that, at the time, seemed like nothing. The Hell in a Cell concept was born from Foley's own bold idea. to add a roof to the cage. When preparing for the bout with The Undertaker, Foley sought out Terry Funk for advice. According to the accounts, it was Funk who jokingly suggested being thrown off the top of the cell. And Foley took that joke and made a reality. Imagine the atmosphere at the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. 16,000 fans held their breath. Everyone knew about the first match between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. But what unfolded with Mankind went far beyond anyone's imagination. Jimmy Corderas, who was stationed at the monitors, described the pure terror of watching that scene unfold. When Mankind was hurled from the top of the cell through the announcer's table. The sound of that impact still haunts many to this day. It was a moment that forces us to ask, why? Why would a human being voluntarily put themselves in that position? According to the documents, Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious after the chokeslam through the cage, marking the first time in his career he had been completely wiped out. Dr. Francois Petit, who was there, recounted his deep concern when he saw that Foley's eyes were not responding. Sources suggest that, in that moment, the professionalism of the wrestlers was pushed to its absolute limit. Terry Funk, as a colleague, had to take charge, creating improvised spots to draw attention away from Foley, allowing medical staff to enter the ring. The truly astounding part was that Foley continued the match. This resilience drove the crowd into a frenzy, but it also raises a profound ethical question. When is enough enough? Looking back at this event, we see a multifaceted story. It is a tale of a man who wanted to give his all to his craft. But it is also a cautionary tale about long-term consequences. Brain injuries, chronic pain, things that the wrestling industry did not fully grasp the implications of at the time. Foley admits that after his match with The Rock in the infamous I Quit match, where he endured a barrage of blows to the head, he faced severe damage. Today, as we look back at the footage, we don't just see performances. We see lessons on the price of sacrifice. Foley's loved ones, including his daughter Noelle, have expressed deep concern regarding the impact of these repeated concussions. In the words of Mick Foley himself, after all this time, when he looks back at that cage in the WWE warehouse, he becomes emotional. It is a souvenir of survival, of an era where human limits seemed non-existent. But it is also a reminder that no reward is worth sacrificing one's health. Was it all worth it? That is the question that every one of us must ask ourselves when revisiting this historical documentary. Mick Foley's career concluded with the status of a legend, but his legacy at Hell in a Cell remains a chapter that demands reflection in the history of American professional wrestling. Thank you for joining me as we revisit this raw piece of history. I look forward to seeing you in our next installment. Certainly, as a veteran sports commentator who has spent decades analyzing the gritty, often dark corners of professional wrestling, I have transformed the provided material into a compelling narrative script. Here is the documentary-style commentary on the legacy of Mick Foley and the Hell in a Cell match. Dark Side of the Ring, the Hardcore Legend and the Cell. On June 28th, 1998, at the World Wrestling Federation King of the Ring pay-per-view. A single match etched its name into the annals of sports history as one of the most harrowing spectacles ever witnessed. It was The Undertaker versus Mankind inside the Hell in a Cell. Hell in a Cell hits you like a mallet to the consciousness. I knew it was going to be intense, but I did not know it would transcend the boundaries of human expectation. You had two performers who were willing to push the envelope until it fell right over the edge. People say wrestling is fake, but you cannot fake gravity. I have been frightened by many things in this business, but nothing terrified me quite like that until the match truly began. What left the audience stunned was the unrelenting, visceral punishment Mick Foley endured. Until you saw it, you simply did not believe a human being could sustain that level of trauma and survive. The pain was real. The drama was, in every sense, authentic. As a commentator, I was screaming, cursing, questioning why he was doing this. The legacy of Hell in a Cell remains an epic success, yet it stands as a grim, cautionary tale. We dodged bullets that day, not just one, but several. The man behind the mask. Everyone who enters this industry is searching for something missing in their own lives. For Mick Foley, it was a profound need to be liked. He once recounted a story from his sophomore year in college where he staged a fall, spitting out a concoction of red food coloring to simulate blood on a concrete floor. When he heard the crowd react with disgust, he realized that if he could not make people love him, he could make them notice him through sheer shock. Mick Foley, the hardcore legend, was born from this desire to elicit a response. His daughter, Noelle, notes that he simply loved the "oh my God" factor. His wife, Colette, who has known him for over 35 years, saw beyond the persona to a gentle man. But even she recognized that his adrenaline-fueled drive to be unforgettable came at a massive personal cost. The rise of a lunatic. Under the guise of Cactus Jack, Mick cultivated a reputation for being wild, unpredictable, and dangerous. Jim Cornette, who served as a producer during that era, remembers how Foley understood the psychology of the audience. He knew fans were drawn to those who operated outside the script. When Foley joined the World Wrestling Federation, Vince McMahon was initially skeptical. He did not see a marketable star. It was Jim Ross who championed Foley, believing The Undertaker needed a truly deranged opponent to elevate his own character. Out of that necessity, the persona of Mankind was born, a character who would claw his own hair out to connect with the audience. The Descent. When the Hell in a Cell concept was revived for the match against The Undertaker, Foley reached out to Terry Funk for advice. In a moment that would change history, they joked about starting the match on top of the cage. The joke soon became a terrifying reality. Standing on top of that cell, Foley was genuinely terrified. He was never comfortable with heights. As the two men stood 16 feet above the concrete, the structural integrity of the cage began to fail. When The Undertaker launched him toward the Spanish announce table, it felt like slow motion. The sound of that crash is something no one who heard it will ever forget. Everyone backstage assumed it was over. You looked at his limp body and thought he is dead. But then, against all logic, he began to stir. He was determined to continue. As Dr. Francois Petit arrived to tend to his injuries, Foley was already focused on the next sequence. He felt that as long as he was involved, the audience remained engaged. It was a masterpiece of danger, but a dangerous one nonetheless. The final toll. The second major spot, a chokeslam that drove Foley through the mesh and into the ring, accompanied by a heavy steel chair, left him legitimately unconscious for 42 seconds. When he finally regained consciousness, the match continued, even as he was missing teeth and suffering from a dislocated jaw and a bruised kidney. The aftermath of that night changed the trajectory of his career, propelling him toward the World Championship. However, it also sparked a long-term conversation about the physical toll of such performances. Later, in an I Quit match against The Rock, Foley would endure 11 unprotected chair shots to the head, a moment his children still find difficult to process. Today, the medical community warns of the long-term effects of such trauma, including chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Mick Foley knows the price he has paid. He lives with the reality of his choices. Yet he speaks about his career with a mix of reflection and pride. Was it worth it? That is a question Mick, his family, and the fans must continue to ask. He created moments that will outlive us all, and he did it by offering his heart and soul to the business he loved. Whether it was a brilliant performance or a descent into unnecessary madness, one thing is certain. There will never be another hardcore legend. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. You have spent your life looking into the dusty, blood-stained, and tear-soaked corners of this industry. And today we turn our gaze toward a chapter that any true student of Dark Side of the Ring must approach with a mix of awe and heavy-hearted reflection. Here is the commentary, rewritten in the tone of a legendary American sports broadcaster. Shadows of the Ring, the Ballad of the Hardcore Legend. June 28, 1998. The Pittsburgh Civic Arena. A night that irrevocably altered the trajectory of professional wrestling. We are not merely discussing about. We are dissecting the Hell in a Cell encounter between The Undertaker and Mankind. It was a masterpiece of madness, a cautionary tale written in blood, and a haunting testament to the physical price of immortality. According to those closest to the scene, this was never a perfectly paved road to glory. Mick Foley, the man we came to know as the Hardcore Legend, was not simply stepping into a cage. He was searching for something missing in his own life, a desperate, all-consuming need to be accepted, or if that was denied, to be feared. As Foley himself has recounted, his fascination with using pain as a bridge to the audience began in his college years, where he discovered that he could command a reaction by becoming the most visceral and perhaps the most repulsive version of himself. When Vince McMahon, by various accounts, initially failed to see a marketable star in Foley, it was the persistence of figures like Jim Ross that cleared the path for his arrival in the World Wrestling Federation. Yet, The Undertaker required a dancing partner, a lunatic capable of shedding the monotony of a typical big man feud. Enter Mankind. The match began with a concept that Terry Funk once joked about as an absurdity, starting the fight on top of the cage. To Mick Foley, however, it was no punchline. He became possessed by the idea, turning it into a tangible, bone-chilling reality. We watched as 600 pounds of human weight descended upon that mesh, until the zip ties holding the structure together snapped, a sound like a volley of gunfire signaling an impending catastrophe. The image of Mick Foley being launched 20 feet through the air and crashing onto the announce table remains perhaps the most visceral snapshot in the history of televised sports. Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were not performing. They were witnessing a man being treated like a disposable object. Every soul backstage, from the veterans to the crew, believed they had just seen a man perish. Yet, according to those present, he rose. He climbed again. This was no longer theater. It was a sacrifice for the sake of a legacy. Then came the choke slam through the roof of the cell. According to the records, it was the first time in his career that Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious. 42 seconds of total darkness. The ringside figures, Dr. Francois Petit, Terry Funk, flooded the cage in a state of genuine terror, believing they were looking at a life nearing its end. Funk even had to intervene, shielding The Undertaker from the focus so that others could tend to the broken man. But despite the shattered teeth, the dislocated jaw, and the internal trauma, Foley pushed on. Why? Because that was who he was. The 17-minute ordeal finally reached its conclusion, leaving 16,000 fans in Pittsburgh breathless. But the cost? 6 weeks of bruised kidneys, a dislocated jaw, and a lingering specter of severe head trauma. As medical experts have long warned, consecutive concussions represent a slow-acting poison to the human brain. Subsequent battles, like the grueling I Quit match against The Rock, only deepened the void of his physical degradation. Foley's family, his wife Colette, and his children lived in the shadow of this terror every time he stepped through the curtain. Years later, we're still left with the question that all of us must ask. Was it worth it? Was the roar of the crowd, the fleeting validation of strangers, worth the price of a future stolen? Foley himself went through his own internal darkness, grappling with the feeling that he had achieved nothing if he was defined solely by that one night of carnage. Yet, through his bond with The Undertaker and an eventual embrace of his own history, he began to reconcile with the ghost of that cage. While the threat of long-term neurodegenerative disease remains an ever-present reality. Foley has chosen to confront it by turning his trauma into a medium for storytelling, finding solace in the very audience that once demanded his blood. When we look back at Hell in a Cell, we do not see a mere wrestling match. We see a man who used his own physiology as a canvas to paint a sublime, agonizing piece of performance art, just to feel the pulse of the crowd. It is the beauty and the cold, unyielding cruelty of professional wrestling. A dangerous masterpiece that, for better or for worse, the world will never be able to unsee. I have completed the requested rewrite. Would you like me to delve deeper into the psychological analysis of any other performer? Or perhaps explore another specific behind-the-scenes event from Foley's storied career? Welcome back to the program. I am your guide through the shadows and the legends that have defined the landscape of professional wrestling. Today, we peel back the curtain on a chapter that remains etched in the minds of anyone who has ever followed this industry, a moment that still makes one shudder. It was June 28th, 1998, at the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring pay-per-view. The Pittsburgh Civic Arena shook as two titans, The Undertaker and Mankind, stepped inside the unforgiving steel structure known as Hell in a Cell. That was not just a match, it was a new definition of brutality. As we often say, professional wrestling may be scripted, but gravity never lies. And on that night, we witnessed the raw, unfiltered truth of human pain. According to those who were there, voices like Jim Ross, Jim Cornette, and Mick Foley himself, the space inside that cell was nothing short of a death trap. A towering machine of steel. Mick Foley, the man known as the hardcore legend, walked into that structure with a burning desire to create a legacy-defining moment. He did not just want to compete, he wanted the audience to be stunned, disgusted, and ultimately, to never forget his name. Imagine this. Foley did not start the match inside the cage, as was customary. He climbed to the top, an act that, according to witnesses, left the entire backstage area in a state of sheer panic. The zip ties holding the top of the cage began to snap under the weight of two men. And then it happened. A free fall from nearly 20 feet through the announcer's table. The sound of that impact changed our perception of human endurance forever. According to documented accounts and personal testimonies, many were convinced that Foley had perished on the spot. But he didn't. He rose. He continued. He endured a choke slam that sent him through the top of the cell onto the unforgiving surface below, accompanied by a heavy steel chair that struck his face with sickening force. Those close to him recall that even the most seasoned veterans were screaming in terror. Dr. Francois Petit, the World Wrestling Federation doctor at the time, rushed the ring like a first responder at a disaster scene. Why would he do such a thing? That is the question we must ask. Mick Foley has shared that, as a college student, he discovered the power of crowd reaction. If he could not make people love him in the traditional sense, he would force them to pay attention through shock and visceral disgust. That drive propelled him through death matches filled with thumbtacks, barbed wire, and explosives in Japan before he ever arrived at the World Wrestling Federation. Yet the price paid was steep. Beyond the 15 stitches in his lip, the 2 lost teeth, the dislocated jaw, and the bruised kidney, there were the cumulative brain injuries. His children, Mickey and Noelle Foley, and his wife, Colette, lived in constant, agonizing fear. They did not see the glory. They saw the physical torture. Backstage, Vince McMahon reportedly demanded that Foley never attempt such a feat again. However, history had already been written. That match not only propelled Foley to become the world champion just 6 months later, but it also cemented his status as a symbol of limitless sacrifice. But when the lights dimmed and the roar of the crowd faded, we are left to confront the most profound question of all. Was it worth it? Mick Foley today, while reflecting on those injuries and the looming reality of chronic brain trauma, remains composed. He views it as the cost of a dream he chose to chase. His spoken word performances now serve as mental gymnastics, an effort to maintain his sharpness. Perhaps Hell in a Cell was not only the zenith of Mick Foley's career, but also a sobering wake-up call for the entire industry. We witnessed a man wager his very life for a moment of immortality in the minds of the fans. We witnessed madness, courage, and the long-term consequences that are impossible to fully calculate. Beyond the bright lights of the wrestling stage, stories remain about choices and the price of fame. Mick Foley survived the cell, but the scars, both physical and psychological, remain as testament to an era where the line between reality and performance was thinner than ever. We saw it, we heard it, and now each of us is left to our own reflections regarding the ultimate limits of the human spirit. Do those fleeting moments of brilliance truly justify the cost to one's health and future? Perhaps that is a question for which there will never be a single, simple answer. Welcome, everyone, to the show. I am your guide through the shadows and the defining moments that have forged the history of professional wrestling. Today, we peel back the layers of one of the most shocking and haunting chapters that anyone who has ever followed this business can never forget. June 28th, 1998. At the King of the Ring pay-per-view, a match ascended from the realms of sports entertainment into a living, breathing nightmare broadcast live to the world. The Undertaker versus Mankind in Hell in a Cell. A dangerous masterpiece, a high-stakes gamble with death that, even to this day, leaves us asking the question, was it worth it? Hell in a Cell hits you like a mallet to the consciousness. I have been there, I have analyzed countless moments in my career, but I have never felt such sheer, unadulterated terror as I did that night in Pittsburgh. We often talk about wrestling being a production, a script, entertainment, but never forget, you can never fake gravity. According to those involved, Mick Foley, the man known as the hardcore legend, approached that match with a burning need to be accepted. Foley shared that, even in college, he sought powerful reactions from the public, sometimes by disgusting them as a substitute for being unable to make them love him. It was a complex psychology, a drive that pushed him toward the unthinkable. At that time, the World Wrestling Federation was in a period of evolution. Jim Ross, as Vice President of Talent Relations, acknowledged that they needed top-tier opponents for The Undertaker. Vince McMahon, the titan of the industry, initially did not even value Mick Foley, believing he lacked the qualities to be a star. But it was that recklessness, the calculated insanity Foley brought to the Mankind character, that eventually convinced them. When the concept of Hell in a Cell was proposed, Foley and Terry Funk mapped out an unthinkable script, starting the match on top of the 20-foot cage. Imagine that, 600 pounds of human beings standing precariously on the roof. The plastic zip ties holding the mesh began to give way under the sheer weight. And then the moment happened. The Undertaker threw Mankind off the top of the cell through the Spanish announce table below. The sound of that impact, according to those on the scene, was no different from a horrific car accident. Those backstage were left in shock. They thought it was over, that he had perished. But no, Foley continued. Was it insanity or a steel spirit? According to reports, it was a blend of adrenaline and a desire to create a historical moment that he knew the audience would never forget. However, the true tragedy lay in the second chokeslam, where the structure of the cell gave way, and Foley crashed onto the hard ring mat, followed by a heavy steel chair colliding with his face. That was the first time in his career that Mick Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious. His colleagues, Dr. Francois Petit and The Undertaker himself, all feared for his life. Terry Funk even had to proactively ask The Undertaker to strike him, just to divert the crowd's attention and buy time for medical personnel to reach Foley. What is truly staggering is that despite a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a concussion, and internal injuries, Foley finished the match. When he finally rose, with a tooth lodged in his nose, he created an image that became a symbol of sacrifice in professional wrestling. We must look at this objectively. That match changed Mick Foley's career, taking him from a guy deemed not marketable to a world champion just 6 months later. But the price paid was steep. Years later, as we understand more about the long-term effects of concussions and the implications of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, we see the cruelty of those decisions. Foley has had to face chronic pain, memory loss, and deep anxiety about his future. His family, especially his wife, Colette, and his children, had to watch their father and husband dismantle himself on national television. Their resentment was not without cause. It serves as a brutal lesson on the blurred line between artistic dedication and self-destruction. Mick Foley later shared that he once harbored resentment toward the Hell in a Cell match because it overshadowed everything else he had achieved. But eventually, he learned to embrace it as part of his legacy. Standing before that old steel cage in a warehouse, seeing the remnants of the past, Foley broke down in tears. Those were not just tears of pain, they were tears of release. In the end, we must ask ourselves if they had known the consequences, would they have chosen that path? Foley says he isn't sure he would have done anything differently, because for him, that was the cost to touch greatness, to create moments that millions around the world are still talking about nearly 3 decades later. Professional wrestling is a world of paradoxes, where one finds life through facing death, where agony is transformed into admiration. Hell in a Cell was not just a match. It is a reminder that behind the lights, the falls, and the cheers are human beings, flesh and blood, who were willing to bet everything just to be remembered. Mick Foley's story remains an indelible chapter in the chronicles of this industry, a warning, a legend, and above all, a testament to the limits of human endurance. We will leave it there to reflect. In your opinion, is fame ever a fair price for the permanent physical toll an athlete must carry for the rest of their life?